What's up, everyone? Welcome to Chasing Signals, the first real version of this that we've had. We did a kind of pre-Thanksgiving Wednesday show, but this is going to be the kind of the normal cadence here with me and Ben as we run through the games for Week 12 and kind of preview them through the lens of stealing signals, stat chasing, that type of advanced stat type of approach, but looking forward to the week ahead. Ben, how's it going?
Good, man. Yeah. Fun Thanksgiving. We were just talking about kind of reviewing with each other before we started the show how our days went. I did pretty well, but more importantly, had a fun Thanksgiving with the family. My wife cooked a bunch of food. It's funny. We had her mom came over because she was going to be alone, and she kind of has been pretty good about quarantining and those things. So it was me, my wife, my mother-in-law, and my two daughters, who all are not necessarily big eaters. So I had to kind of put on my cape and carry the team on my back because my wife just cooked a ton of food. And my role at that point is to make her feel like she did a great job and just eat as much as I can.
Yeah, that's a good position to be in.
Yeah.
We went out to a little outdoor dining spot, so we didn't have any prep to do or any hosting. So nice. All in all, no travel, just stayed here in Brooklyn. So pretty good Thanksgiving. But yeah, I think this is like an interesting Friday here because I feel like in terms of my mental prep, it feels more like a Tuesday or Wednesday looking at the slate because Thanksgiving took, kind of sucked up so much of the attention. So it's been kind of fun to almost scramble here and start to look ahead at Sunday. We're going to be rolling through each of these games and talking through what jumps out to us about each game. We're going to try to keep this. We said an hour. That seems like a pipe dream, but we're going to try to keep it somewhat tight. And I don't know. Let's get rolling with Las Vegas and Atlanta. This is a game that has a 53 over under. We were just noting that dropped quite a bit. We had to update that line, and so we could talk through that. And the team totals here: Las Vegas 28, Atlanta 25, with Vegas favored by 3 points in this game. So, Ben, what did you make of the total dropping here, and just general thoughts on the game?
Yeah, general thoughts are that I'm just not finding myself as excited about this game as I feel like I should be because of the total. So I had kind of put that down before we saw that the total had gone down because we originally had 55 in here. And we were kind of talking about why that went down because there's no weather. It's a dome game. Probably just because it was a super high number at one point. But I'm intrigued by a 53 over under, but not as intrigued maybe as I should be. But it'll be a game certainly to have exposure to in DFS. And the biggest one I'm interested in this game is Nelson Aguilar and like Henry. It just hasn't happened with Henry Ruggs, right? So like I'm kind of interested in maybe some Derek Carr stacks. I mean, we're jumping right into one of the high totals. I think there's some chalkier games, certainly on the slate. But when I'm looking at it from a DFS perspective, I think Carr is interesting to stack. You'd probably want to double stack him. He's not a big rusher. And so Waller's kind of the lock. And then it's like, do I trust Nelson Aguilar, who's been pretty up and down? I think that's probably the way that I would double stack it. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, Waller is going to be pretty popular. But if you do go with one of the wide receivers, I think the interesting thing about this game as a whole is that the wide receivers are going to be tough to predict beyond like there's kind of a clear-cut receiving option in Waller. On the Raiders, Ridley, but how this all breaks down behind them is going to be tough. Aguilar last week, I mean, had a whopper of 0.88, target share of 31%, 59% of the air yards, just a clear-cut lead there. But on the season, it hasn't been like that. I mean, when you go to whopper for the season, Ruggs is at 0.35, and so is Nelson Aguilar. So they're right there, at exactly the same share of the offense. But Aguilar's been a little bit better recently, although even week 10 Henry Ruggs actually had the bigger whopper, slightly bigger whopper in week 9. And Ruggs was the one with the volume in week 8. So I don't know. I guess to me, it's tough, right? Because you've got both these guys have high ADOTs typically. And so something like target share, air yard share is going to swing on, does this guy earn one deep target versus another? You know what I mean? Like it's like a volatile whopper situation where normally we think of the underlying volume as being more stable. But when you've got guys who have ADOTs of 15 or whatever, Aguilar for the season is at 14.4 and Ruggs is at 18.3. So 1 to 2 targets different suddenly have a massive swing in the air yards as well. So I do think that makes it much harder to predict.
Yeah, one note I would have on Aguilar is back in weeks 1 and 2, he barely ran any routes. So that because Brian Edwards was playing well ahead of him, then Edwards got hurt, and Edwards has been back now for I think 3 weeks where he's been active and just hasn't cut into Aguilar's role at all. If he's cutting anyone, it's been Ruggs. Ruggs ran his fewest routes per drop back last week since week 5 before their bye, and Aguilar stayed pretty steady.
Yep.
So to me, it seems like Aguilar's role is pretty established at this point, and but you're right when you look at it from a season perspective. Even if you just look from week 3 on, his whopper's only 0.41. It's not amazing, but
and they have the same weighted targets per route run on the season. And Henry Ruggs ran a route on 85% of dropbacks in week 10. Nelson Aguilar was at 78%, and Edwards was at 15% there. So in week 10, you'd say, maybe Edwards coming back hurt Nelson Aguilar and didn't really affect Henry Ruggs. And this past week, you think, wow, Brian Edwards really hurt Henry Ruggs and not Nelson Aguilar. But it just kind of feels like a little bit volatile here, to where I wouldn't be shocked at all if Aguilar had the clear-cut lead again. I also wouldn't be shocked if Aguilar fell way down and we saw a big game from Ruggs.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, totally. And if you look at his game log, it backs it up too. Like, that's the other key thing. Is like, he was good last week. He's had a couple good splash games. Week 7, he had 100 yards and a TD on 9 targets. Last week, he had 88 yards and a TD on 9 targets. Week 9, in the middle there, he only had 3 targets, but he went for 55 and a TD. But then weeks 8 and 10, he had 2 targets, no catches, 4 targets, 1 catch. So he's had these 2 complete duds in between, some pretty good games. And other than those duds, he's scored in each of his last, 5 games. So 5 of his last 7. He's been very, very hit or miss. So yeah, that fits with everything you're saying as well. It's an interesting.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't know I don't have like a nice button for that situation, except that it kind of reminds me of like the unpredictability of it. Reminds me a little bit of the Atlanta side, where we've seen. I want to get your thoughts on like how they replace Julio Jones, assuming we don't get him, because this past week we both noticed that Christian Blake had played a lot more. It seemed like Olamide Zaccheaus was the guy who would benefit from a Julio Jones miss, but that's not what happened during the game when Julio wasn't playing. What are your thoughts on how they roll these guys out if Julio doesn't go?
My thoughts are basically that it's probably going to be more or less one or the other, but that it's not really been consistent. And I think I kind of implied in Stealing Signals earlier this year that maybe they're just rotating those guys like on a week-to-week basis, like preparing one, giving one the first team reps in practice and having them prepared for that week and seeing what they have. Usually we don't think of teams necessarily doing that, but I think that would be a kind of a sharp way of approaching it. I just don't trust it is what it comes down to. I feel like it could be either of them. I wouldn't play either of them in any kind of seasonal or anything, obviously, but in DFS even, I think they're pretty thin plays because you don't even know if the target volume is going to be there. Last week it was Russell Gage who got 12 targets, but he's not been good either. He hasn't had 75 yards since week 1. He's this underneath guy who, even though he had 12 targets last week, did not do very well. And I'll be curious about, like, do we know Jones is out for sure? Like, I don't know. You're usually better on the news than I am, but where are we at with Jones?
I think he's questionable.
He's got a hammy, but
yeah,
he got an unlimited practice early in the week is what I saw. So if he plays, I mean, I would certainly start him in seasonal. It's a really good spot against Las Vegas, high total game. And I think he would be it'd be like a perfect, Julio Jones, cheap, unowned spot for him to just go off. Cause that's sort of what Julio does in those spots. It seems like that's when he has his big game. So when no one's on him.
Yep. Yeah, I certainly am on board with that. I do think that if Julio doesn't go, that Calvin Ridley, like especially in PPR, especially like on DraftKings, would be pretty interesting because you've got a situation where if Zacchaeus plays a ton, Zacchaeus generally plays that like poor man's Julio type of role where he's running deep and he can help keep things open for Ridley to just rack up receptions. But if Zacchaeus doesn't get a lot of playing time, then that means we probably have a lot of Christian Blake on the field. I don't think Christian Blake's very good. He kind of plays a poor man's Calvin Ridley. And then Ridley would slot more into the deep threat Julio Jones type of role. So either way you slice it, if there's no Julio, I think Ridley could end up having a big game. Obviously you're starting Ridley, but I'm just saying, I think it could end up being good for Ridley if go either way.
And this just gets back to your point at the top of the game is like these are difficult passing games to have like a clear stance on. And that's what we know about wide receivers anyway in fantasy, obviously, is that they're volatile and we both think probabilistically. I don't try to define it too much. The good players I play in seasonal, when it comes to DFS, I'm looking at ownership usually and trying to find places where people are overlooking that volatility and what guys might have upside. So that that's where, Julio could be an interesting play. But we're getting some comments, and I'm seeing a tweet from Tom Pelissero that Gurley's been ruled out. So Brian Hill's going to end up being a pretty interesting discussion point on this slate for sure.
Yeah, where are you at on Brian Hill?
I mean, he's been pretty good. He's been pretty clearly the number 2. It wouldn't be crazy to see some Ito Smith or some even Kadri Allison, who's a big back and could take some goal line work. But my expectation would be probably we'll get at least 15 touches from Hill with Gurley out. So, his price is so cheap, and Las Vegas is not a good defense that I think I'm going to be, certainly considering him in like cash scenarios. It'll be interesting to see, how heavy the field gets on him from an ownership perspective. I wasn't really expecting Gurley to be out. This is like kind of new for me.
Yeah. One of the things that I had written down as a note was that there was a big snap count. The snaps were tilted towards Brian Hill last week. So I was already kind of interested in what was going on here with Hill versus Gurley. For like, longer term purposes, dynasty purposes or whatever. I'm kind of intrigued to see if Hill can maybe steal this job with a couple of good performances. But I as far as DFS goes, I'm very much with you that I want to see where the ownership falls. Because if he's going to be like mega chalk, it's not something I'm going to be that interested in, I don't think. Where are you at on the other side with Jacobs? This does seem like it could end up being a pretty sweet spot for him. You'd imagine the Raiders will probably want to run the ball more than other teams might here in this spot.
Yeah, and his routes dropped back a little bit last week, but they've been ticking up. They were a season high in week 10, which the previous high was week 1, and then immediately kind of dropped off. It was like John Gruden wanted to prove that he was going to throw to Josh Jacobs because he talked about it all offseason, and he did literally the same thing last year. Week 1, Josh Jacobs played a ton. It ended up being a season-high snap share, and then it dropped right off. And I talked about that early in the season in signals that Gruden kind of seems like the kind of guy that would do that. It would just like lean so heavily on him and then immediately shift back to a rotation because it just made sense. His backups were these pass catchers and everything. But we are actually seeing some sustained uptick in his routes. At least, week 9, he was back at 50% for the first time since week 1. And then week 10, it was a season high 63%. It fell down to 42% last week. But his snap rate's been up a little bit these last couple weeks as well. So, I'm certainly willing to trust it at this point, thinking that he's a little bit more of what people had hoped he was earlier. And then you have some people that were maybe on him that weren't getting what they hoped and then are maybe off him. So he might actually be kind of an interesting, sneaky, DFS down the stretch play. I don't have him on any teams, but
yeah, we got a note here that he's back on the injury report with a hip. I think Devontae Booker's been kind of one of the elite handcuffs for the last few weeks now, where if Jacobs were to miss a game, he would just be a smash. But
yep.
Any other notes on this game?
No.
Okay. Moving to Arizona and New England, where we have Arizona favored in New England by 2. The over-under is 49.5. So Arizona with the 25.75 team total, New England at 23.75. We have, I think, maybe a situation where one team is going to want to play fast, and the Cardinals, maybe New England disagrees with that notion. So there's a little bit of a push and pull with the pace of this game. We're not going to have Larry Fitzgerald due to COVID, so Andy Isabella is going to be pretty popular in DFS. What are your thoughts overall on this game?
Yeah, the pace is a big one. It's in New England, and New England's been such a tough team to read from a real football perspective. Sometimes they look like they could maybe compete with sort of this, run and defense style, particularly when Cam Newton's been, has looked good at times early this season. Everyone was saying, "Wow, I can't believe the Patriots got him for so cheap." And then right after he spent some time on the COVID list, it was, that's why they got him for so cheap. He's bad again, right? Everybody hated him again. So it's interesting to consider if New England can control this game. It's only a 2-point spread. I think Arizona's a pretty strong team, but if they lead, they'll force New England to play a little faster, I think, which makes this an interesting potential, maybe not shootout, but certainly a game that could be higher scoring. But then if New England leads, you have to expect that they would just run a ton. And, Arizona can have some bouts of inefficiency offensively at times. I could see this end up being kind of one of the worst games for their offense in a while. I'm still obviously playing Kyler everywhere. I'm not as thrilled about him going into Foxborough in, late November and in a DFS.
Dealing with the shoulder issue.
Right.
And, Larry Fitzgerald being out actually might help. But on that point, I think Andy Isabella, he's going to be pretty chalky. One thing that I've noticed is that, on a per route basis, he hasn't been that heavily involved over the last few weeks. It's going to be noisy because, when you're running as few routes as Andy Isabella, he was out there for 34% in week 11. He was out there for 23% in week 10. So at that level of routes, if you get 2 targets versus 3 targets, it looks much better, you're in terms of targets per route run, et cetera. So it's tough to make too much of the latest trend. It's probably just noise. On a season long perspective, he has a weighted target per route run of 0.46, which is actually higher than Christian Kirk, second only to DeAndre Hopkins among the wide receivers who've gotten any real playing time. So where are you at on Isabella? We're not going to have Larry Fitzgerald. That's, I believe, a lock.
I'm probably not going to be playing him in really any format, and I do have him in some deeper dynasty leagues where I could play him. I think there is a lot to that noise that you referenced could be possible. Because he did have a couple of games where he's seen a little bit more run and hasn't necessarily produced, and that extends back to last year too, in some spots where he played, and I had some hopes. So with Isabella at this point, for me, it's I'm going to need to see him actually play and produce more than a big play. I mean, he certainly is always going to have big play potential. We know he's a downfield threat. He has speed. But yeah, he ran routes on 60% back in week 7. And he got 3 targets, had 1 catch for 7 yards. I'm more interested in Kirk right now because Kirk has been trending up. He actually ran routes on 98% of dropbacks last week. It was a season high. It was only a second game over 90%. Early in the year, it was a little unclear whether it was Isabella, Kirk, or, a split of those two as sort of this third receiver. And they obviously run some 4 receiver sets, one of the higher 4 receiver rates in the league. But Isabella was getting some chances to run close to 50% of routes earlier. That's kind of trailed off. And it's also weird to think about like how the roles are impacted, right? Because Fitz is like a tight end, essentially. I mean, he is. Like he's just like straight up a tight end. And Kirk has been running downfield routes, and Isabella has as well. And it just seems like Kirk so clearly won that job, I guess, that job in the offense. They could kick him inside, Kirk, and I think we've always sort of wanted to see more slot work out of him.
I don't think that's what happens. I think Kirk stays outside and runs all of his routes the way he has been, and then we get Isabella running from the slot.
Like underneath?
I don't know. I mean, part of me, that's why I say, like, I think it might be helpful that Larry Fitzgerald's not in the game, because, like, I don't know that you need Larry Fitzgerald. Like, DeAndre Hopkins runs all of his routes underneath. His ADOT,
right,
is usually below 10. On the season, it's I believe, it's 8.9 on the season. So he's definitely an underneath option, and they actually do have tight ends. Max Williams and Dan Arnold get some run. So having another guy with a higher ADOT on the field is actually pretty normal. You look at the Chargers, they've got Guyton and Mike Williams, both run a lot of deep routes. We already talked about the Raiders have that same setup. So it's not uncommon that you might have, especially if you've got 4 wide receivers out there, 2 of them running deeper. So no, I don't think Andy Isabella's ADOT, even if he is running from the same positioning as Fitzgerald, will be super low. I mean, Fitzgerald's ADOT last week was 4.3, 6.2 the week before that. So I think that's a Larry Fitzgerald old man thing.
Yeah, it is. But those targets, when you watch the game, those targets are a part of their offense. There's so many of those that are just Fitzgerald looking at Kyler and Kyler throwing to him and then gaining 5 yards right off the line of scrimmage because he's not getting pressed and he's in his room and he just like catches these quick passes or he runs a really quick curl. It's sort of this like savvy veteran stuff. And Kyler seems to like those. And there's been for so long, we've wanted them to be more vertical and more of an air raid. We've joked, I think it was Reed who coined the horizontal raid term that Kyler seems to take more of these horizontal passes, low ADOT passes than we'd like to see. So in theory, I totally see what you're saying, but I have a hard time envisioning that they'll actually push the ball downfield with 2 deep, consistently deep threats. Kirk, even in his role, has seen certainly some underneath targets.
He has. I like this comment from Mike here, thinking that maybe Hopkins sees a lot of underneath targets.
Right. It could happen. It's probably best for Hopkins.
It might be best for Hopkins. I agree.
And then it's interesting to think about, the whole Patriots take away the number 1 option or whatever, if they key on him, but will they key on him on these short little dump offs? I mean, Arizona passing game is a tough one for this week, for sure.
It is. Yeah, but I do think there's quite a bit of upside in Hopkins. Certainly there's, you're playing New England. There's the pace issue. It's like a cliche, but, the making the offense play left-handed, I think, is definitely something that Belichick tries to do. So that definitely lowers the floor for Hopkins, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I'm thinking about it is I'm still just kind of thinking in terms of like broad volume, not necessarily thinking about how they get there. I still think Hopkins is going to be the clear best bet to lead in volume. Obviously, there's a lot of variance in pass catching volume, but he's still the clear best bet. And there's tons of upside, like we're talking about, if he just sees 10 underneath targets or more. And then Kirk is, I think, the very clear second best bet, because Kirk, I think, could see a few more underneath targets and still see some downfield work. And then Isabella is like hazy to be the third option and not even clear to be the third option, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you. Moving to the New England side here, I think the question is going to be, well, there's a couple questions, because now we have Rex Burkhead's done for the year with the knee injury. So we have James White now potentially absorbing that role. I could see them giving a few more targets to Damian Harris out of the backfield, where maybe he kind of moves into more of a Burkhead role, Sony Michel's and a Sony Michel role potentially. And James White doesn't just get to feast on his role plus Rex Burkhead, but that's certainly on the table, that he kind of gets this, 2 running back role in one, getting all the target volume. We also have the situation at wide receiver where Jacoby Myers had a big dud last week. He had a whopper of 0.16, just 8% of the air yards, 8% of the targets, 5% of the air yards, 3 targets for 12 air yards. It was gross, but Jacoby Myers had been coming off these huge games where he had established himself. I mean, in week 10, he was just the entire passing offense. Damiere Byrd, N'Keal Harry were not targeted in that game. Jacoby Myers had a whopper of 0.95. So we've seen him get just absurd, target domination, 1.09 in week 9. So where are you at on Jacoby Myers? Let's start there with last week's dud. Is that kind of, exposing the mirage that was Jacoby Myers, or are you still kind of in based on what we've seen before that?
Somewhere in the middle. I'm not trusting him like I would normally trust a guy who had his type of volume over multiple weeks and then just had one down game. Normally that to me is just like, okay, target variance, not a big deal. But it's harder for me to trust it with him, more specifically because of the Patriots and just sort of how they tend to have these like ebbs and flows in their season where it's tough to look back too far sometimes. It's like what happened last week is what I'm paying the most attention to with them usually. But they're a tough offense to read. But yeah, you kind of glossed over the James White the upside by saying, like maybe he could be the Rex Burkhead. I think this is if there's a guy in New England that I want to play like in DFS, I think it's James. So I think this is a really interesting spot for White. His routes were way up last week after Burkhead went down. They had been down for several weeks because Burkhead was also running quite a few routes. It could be that Damian Harris runs more. It could be that Sony Michel comes back and runs some. And Michel is expected back. But the usage we've seen from Michel and Harris kind of indicates that they're both they've both been in that same type of like rushing only role. I do expect one of them will run some routes, but especially if Arizona does get out ahead and dictate the pace like we were talking about at the top of this game, and then New England is chasing points, I could see White playing a lot of second half snaps and basically just like being out there every play as like their 60-70% running back, running a ton of routes. And this could be the type of game where he catches 8 to 10 passes. So I think he's kind of an interesting, like maybe bring back option if you are going to play Kyler in DFS. If you don't have great running back options like so many of us don't in some seasonal spots, and you have White stashed somewhere, I think you can certainly play him in PPR leagues. This feels like a game where he has a pretty good receiving floor as well.
Yeah, and I was listening to Pete. He had Leone on his bankroll challenge this morning, and they were talking about James White. Leone liked him in this slate specifically, kind of the way running back sets up. So that was kind of an interesting point. I agree. I think the ceiling is certainly there. Any other notes before we move on?
No.
All right. So we have the Giants at Cincinnati for the next game. Giants are favored.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
What about Chase Edmonds in that? I mean, not to just linger on this game, but I didn't write this down, but what about Chase Edmonds seeing a few more targets in the Larry Fitzgerald type role? They split
That's
him out.
Interesting. Yeah. That's interesting. Some underneath targets. Because I do think one of the things that has struck me about Arizona all season is that I just don't trust these tight ends. I think, Dan Arnold, Max Williams, neither guy has been getting targets at a high rate at all. I guess it's possible that they are a little bit more involved, but they're not the type of guys that I would really be interested at doing the kind of a dart throw play with. But Edmonds, I mean, you kind of play for a bit more of a shootout game script that he could pay off that way, or if they use him more on some of these shallow targets. So you have a couple left with Edmonds.
They've split him out, so maybe he winds up being part of their solution to the slot option.
That's good. It's an interesting point.
Yeah.
All right, so Giants at Cincinnati. Giants favored by 6, 44 over under, giving Giants a 25 team total. Cincinnati 19, pretty gross, but to be expected with Burrow out. Your note here is one I agree with. Kind of hard to overstate the value hit to the wide receivers.
Yeah,
this is really rough. T. Higgins looking like he could potentially be one of those league winner types down the stretch. That obviously takes a really big hit, although I do think he is a stud. Let's start with the Cincinnati passing game, as sad as it is. Is there any value that can be eked out here?
I mean, like in seasonal formats where you don't have great options, you can still play them. But I'm mostly sitting them. You're right on the point on Higgins. Boyd, the whole reason we got the great discount that we got this year that I thought was kind of ridiculous was because last year, even though he had 148 targets, the efficiency just wasn't there. It's hard for an underneath target with a really bad quarterback. He was playing with Finley last year. They're going to start Brandon Allen in this game. But he had 60.8 catch percentage, so just under 61%. So far this year, he's been catching 79% of his targets. He's been catching 18.5% more percentage points more of his targets. And prior in his career, even when he wasn't necessarily a big producer in his early years, he was always over 65%. Last year, it was down below 61%. The yards weren't there. The yards per target were down from his big breakout 2018. All of that had rebounded this year. And it was like, that's why he was such a great value, because the efficiency was so clearly off for a guy who draws targets so well. But, when we watched the Bengals last year, this is one where I'll again go back into like watching the games. You saw why his efficiency was down. He was getting bad targets, low quality targets. They were bad. Then they add Joe Burrow and it's all good for him. But it's going to be really hard for him to not be bad again now from an efficiency standpoint. I mean, I'm sure he'll continue to get targets, and I do really like him as a player so much. But him and Higgins, it's just their salaries are down. They look like they're interesting in models. In DFS, I'm completely staying away. And it's a good matchup, and I'm just completely staying away because I think they will still catch some ownership before people realize just how big of a value hit this is. And I think it's a massive value hit. They've both been so efficient so far this year, both from a catch percentage, yards per target standpoint, all those things. Boyd had a big game last week. The vast majority of it came in the first half before Burrow got hurt. And Finley was really bad on the stretch. We don't know what we'll get out of Allen, but I'm just not really buying into that at all.
Yeah, I think you're getting hit two ways because the efficiency is going to come down, and Burrow was dropping back a ton. Right. And I don't think they're just going to keep firing with Brandon Allen. We also have potentially Gio missing this game, which unlocks Samaje Perine as an option, but is that an option that we have any interest in? Because this is not necessarily a game or a side that we want to be on. So I don't have too much to say about Perine. I think in seasonal, if you need the running back volume, certainly kind of like a Gus Edwards type of play, assuming that game even goes this week, but not a play I'm that excited about. On the Giants side at running back, if the passing game is as bad as we expect it could be, then Wayne Gallman is a legitimate option here. He has a one green zone touch in 4 straight. Where are you leaning on Wayne Gallman? Like, how seriously do we need to take him? And what could be, pretty nice setup for a running back, favored by 6. He is on the road, but in a game, the Giants, I never thought I would say this season, might dominate.
Yeah, I'm not super high on him, but it is nice to see that he's been getting consistent green zone work. He has 7 out of their 10 total green zone touches over those last 4 games. And certainly he's been sort of touchdown dependent, and that's boosted his production to date. And I don't know that I necessarily expect. I mean, this is a situation where with a 25 team total against the Cincinnati defense that gives up so much yardage, you could expect them to run plenty of plays inside the 10, but I don't like a lot of that is variance, just how many plays teams run in close. He's had some short touchdowns, punch in, we get the DPIs in the end zone, what have you. And I don't know that we'll necessarily see that. Like I'm streaming Daniel Jones in a couple seasonal leagues where I lost Burrow because I think this is a pretty good passing spot too. And Gallman's not, essentially I look at it from high value touches, which is receptions and this green zone work. Gallman's been getting the green zone work. He's not necessarily a lock for all the receptions, but he's been getting some. But in bad offenses, there's not a lot of high value touches overall. This gets back to your Perine point. I'm not really interested in Perine either because Cincinnati's not going to generate a lot of short scoring chances. Even if they win games at some point, if they can beat the Giants here, it's probably going to be a lower scoring game. Like, this game total is lower, and sort of the same deal with Gallman. And in those scenarios, the only time I really am considering it is if the guy's dominating the work. He has to be dominating the snaps. He's got to be dominating the routes. That's what we've been seeing with James Robinson, even in a bad situation. Gallman's been dominating those green zone touches or pretty close to it, which is nice, but he's not really dominating the snaps enough for me to be like super on him.
Yeah. I'm with you. The snap counts haven't really been there. He can get there with a couple touchdowns, and that's definitely in play, but I don't think he's like going to go nuclear or anything. So on the receiving weapon side for the Giants, we've got Sterling Shepard's been like heavily involved since returning. Darius Slayton has been really up and down since then. Evan Ingram also in play. It sounds like maybe you're a little optimistic on these guys if you're willing to stream Daniel Jones, or you're just figuring, one or two of these guys will catch value and you can kind of catch that with Jones where you don't have better options in seasonal.
Yeah, we both like the downfield guys, I think, with the air yards and Whopper, and Slayton's been inconsistent a little bit, but to me is still the most valuable passing weapon in this game. So I wrote here in my notes, is it Slayton, Shepard, Ingram, or is it Slayton, Ingram, Shepard? Shepard's been good, but Ingram's been pretty good too, and you get the tight end thing is going in your favor as well. We obviously know the whole storyline of Ingram. They aren't throwing the ball down the field to him enough. They've been doing it a little bit more. Everyone's talked about that. We're hoping to see more of that, but we haven't necessarily consistently seen that. But he did have 9 or 10 targets in 3 straight games before their last game before their bye. So week 7, 8, 9. Then in week 10, he has a 3-target game. And he's had some really down target games as well, but there was starting to feel like a little bit more consistency in his receiving role again, until that game where his targets dipped. But that was the win against Philly where did they throw a lot in this game? I don't think they did. They threw 28 times. So I'm kind of writing that off a little. It wasn't like a typical game where they throw a decent amount. And Slayton led the team that game with 7 targets. So I think it's kind of like Shepard and Ingram are pretty much on par. I like Slayton the most for his downfield role.
Yeah, I think the ceiling is with Slayton. Shepard will get his targets, I think. He's been pretty consistent in that regard. But yeah, if you're looking for ceiling, then I do think it's Slayton. I noticed the same thing with Ingram, where prior to that week 10 game where things dropped off, he was getting targeted at a better rate. His ADOT hasn't been as atrocious recently as it had been. I mean, you're still seeing it like 7, 8, and 9. It was all between 6 and 7. So that's not ideal. This is actually a little bit higher in week 10, up to 7.7. But it's not down to where it was to start the season, where he had this like ridiculously low ADOT of like 3, 4, 5. And that really hurts. Pete giving us a shout to smash and subscribe. Please do subscribe. We're going to have this show every week, and we've got the regular shape chasing show, stat chasing, so lots of good stuff. But yeah, I think I'm in agreement that Slayton is the preferred play here. But
not a great game.
Not a great game.
Yeah, not a great game overall. No more notes from me, really. It's a game that I want to avoid for the most part, but Jones, if you're desperate, I think is an interesting option.
Yeah. Or Gallman if you're desperate.
Yeah, or Gallman for sure. But and Jones is getting a little bit of like cheap DFS. I mean, he's popping in like some projections and points per dollar, but I don't know that I really want to chase that ceiling because I don't think Cincinnati's going to keep it. This game feels like it's going to be so low scoring.
Yeah. All right, moving to Cleveland. At Jacksonville, Cleveland is favored by 7. The over-under is 49.5. Cleveland with team total 28.25 to Jacksonville's 21.25. Let's start with Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb. One of the things that was strange last week is that Hunt got all 4 of the green zone touches. I saw something on Twitter about how Chubb had lost a contact, and that had been why he wasn't out there. So I don't know if that's the case or not. But I think in either case, my lean on that is that it's sort of fluky. Leone was talking about that with Pete this morning, that he's not really buying into the green zone touches for those guys this past week. is trying to take too much from that. But certainly if Hunt has a lead in the green zone work on top of getting the passing game work, then he's definitely the play. And you note that Hunt is pretty cheap on DraftKings.
Yeah, so Chubb was a lot more efficient running the ball last week. Another bad weather game. Cleveland's played a ton of bad weather games. Mayfield, they've had fewer than 200 net passing yards in, I think, 3 straight and 4 of their last 5. It looks like Mayfield had 204 yards last week in gross, but still, like these are not. There's a clear trend here with the Browns. They want to run the ball really heavily, and they're going to probably use both. Chubb has been the more efficient runner. Typically, it was a tough matchup last week. This is not a tough matchup with Jacksonville's run D. They're 7-point favorites. They are on the road, but you got to expect that they're going to use these two guys quite a bit to win this game. I think there's some longer term sort of interest for me. It's still in Landry and in Hooper mostly, who I think could kind of fill the target vacuum that was created with Odell Beckham getting hurt. But so far that's been filled by very low target rates, very low pass attempt rates, which I think has more to do with the weather than maybe them sustainably throwing 25 or fewer times in games. But that is certainly the way they want to play, is not throwing a ton. But yeah, I don't really like the passing game at all. But if I did, I would be looking at Landry and Hooper as sort of these top ones, and it's hard to go beyond them. And then I think so much of this offense is just going to flow through Chubb and Hunt. So I see Hunt's price, and I know that he has the potential to catch some passes. And whether or not that green zone role is like clearly going to be all his, which I also kind of agree is probably not the case. He's at least getting some work in there. He has the potential to rack up a few high value touches in a game where, I was talking earlier about the Gallman scenario. If it's a really bad offense that's not using their running backs a lot, not generating high value touches, you can't have a committee. But when you're in an offense that's going to lean so heavily on their backs, you kind of can't. That's where I'm okay with using a committee back who's not seeing a massive snap rate, because the offense generally is going to be leaning on the position, and there's such big favorites that you think this is a good spot for him, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I got kind of hung up on what you're saying about Robinson, because that just jumped out to me so much when I read Stealing Signals about the fact that Robinson had such a high snap share even in a bad game script, where he had been a guy that he's a frustrating dude where he can catch passes, but with Chris Thompson in, they would still remove him from the game and have Thompson play, that kind of the up-tempo 2-minute drill type of running back, third down role. And that is how Robinson could end up failing. Dario Gumbawale is like that exact same type of guy as Chris Thompson, but they just don't trust him as much in that role. So you end up seeing a lot more James Robinson. So if this ends up being kind of like even just not a blowout, I do think it's a pretty interesting spot for Robinson, because he can get just so many snaps.
Yeah, I agree with that. And they got to run their offense through him now, because DJ Chark's out, Chris Conley's out. I made a note here. We might get Visca week, and yeah, we've been waiting. We've been patient. But I think he's an interesting option for sure. And Keelan Cole is the other one. Those two guys, especially, I'm looking at like for DFS. If I do use Hunt, I can create these cheap little, because he's pretty cheap. I can create these cheap little mini correlations with either Visca or Keelan, and probably for me it's going to be more Visca, assuming that he's healthy. And then it frees up salary to be more expensive at other parts of your lineup. And then if this game does get at least somewhat interesting, and it does have a 49.5 total, you hope that Hunt, obviously has a big game, and then it leads to more passing on Jacksonville's side, and one of these receivers does well. Visca's in a great spot. He was working his way into a more prominent role with no Chark, no Conley.
Could be nice.
Pretty good opportunity for him.
On Hooper, you talked about him earlier. Where are you at on? I mean, the question of Ebron, it just comes down to like, do we get that game? But where are you on that question? Would you play a guy like Austin Hooper and just lock in the points, or would you wait for Ebron?
Yeah, I'd probably play Hooper. I'm pessimistic about this Pittsburgh Baltimore game. I mean, I know they've moved it to Tuesday now, and that would seem to help, but Baltimore's already said they're closing their facility entirely until Monday, so I'm sure it'll play, but I don't want to rely on it if I have a kind of a toss-up. I think Hooper's probably enough of their passing game, and their passing game has probably been, as I said, lower volume because of weather in a few different games, that Hooper's probably pretty close to Ebron. I don't think they're like that much different right now as far as value, so I would just play Hooper.
I would also play Hooper. Hooper's been good on a target per route run basis, and one of the reasons I like that stat is because for situations like Cleveland where there just haven't been any routes, and you're like, oh yeah, if this guy was actually on a team that had passing attempts, he could put up some points. So I think we could get just Cleveland kind of bouncing back up to the mean a little bit compared to what they've been doing in these terrible weather games. One note I wanted to make before we move on is just that you talked about the Odell Beckham role. I thought it was Rashard Higgins kind of picking up that role, Jarvis Landry kind of staying in his Jarvis Landry role, and Kadarius Hodge was running these like total empty routes, not really involved whatsoever. And then this past week, all of a sudden, Hodge is a big part of the offense. And it occurred to me that, we probably shouldn't take too much away from the previous couple weeks before that, because although week 11 was also a bad weather game, it was a bad weather game because of rain, not because of these insanely high winds. And so what Kadarius Hodge's targets were in those really windy conditions in weeks 9 and 10, weeks 8 and 10, excuse me, who cares? It didn't really mean anything, potentially. So I guess Kadarius Hodge is someone that like I was picking up like really cheaply in Dynasty this week and trying to just like get exposure to him.
Yeah, he had some big air yards. And I've been talking about him in Signal since people were talking about Donovan Peoples-Jones as being the Odell replacement, because Hodge, had kind of won their wide receiver 3 role. Then he got hurt, and then when he came back, he was right back in that role. And I've definitely been mentioning him for a few weeks now. The concern is like even last week. I know you look at a lot of the like team level numbers. Even last week, they only threw 22 times. So like his Whoppers was probably massive because he had tons of air yards, but like he only had 5 targets, and it was a good target share, but that sample's not big enough for me to be like he's going to be a 25% target guy.
I'm with you there. I want to mention him just because it's he made a big statement compared to the weeks 8 and 10 where he looked like just Jalen Guyton, John Hightower type of empty routes, and maybe he is a part of the offense in a meaningful way. Moving to the Carolina at Minnesota game, finally like a fun game to talk about. We have Minnesota favored at home by 3.5. The total here of 51. So Minnesota with a 27.25 team total to Carolina's 23.75. I mean, let's start with Dalvin Cook. Obviously, he's in a smash spot. He had an expected points workload, the RotoViz stat that weights opportunities by the line of scrimmage of like 30 points. So he kind of had a quote unquote bad week last week, still had a monster game, but it could have been a lot higher. His workload is like maybe a favorite to be just as high this week. I mean, you've got just an awesome matchup at home. You know what Minnesota wants to do in this spot. I don't know that Carolina's necessarily going to be able to stop them from doing that. Obviously, Cook's going to be very popular. It's kind of the clear running back play on the main slate, but it strikes me that, that's kind of the way it should be. Where are you at on this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have him in any kind of seasonal or start-sit format, you're starting him. There's just no question he's extremely good at football. In DFS-type setups, I think the interesting question is, he's fairly expensive now too. He's going to be high owned. Is he like what are the paths to him fading if they even exist? I will say that when he's had his really big monster games, he's thrived a little bit on rushing efficiency. He had a 70-yard touchdown run against the Lions in his 200-yard game, and he had the 50-yard touchdown reception against the Packers in his other 200-yard game. And so, I think when you look at his game log, there are paths to him having maybe 2 to 3 catches instead of 4 to 5 catches. That's actually happened for him more often than not. The last couple of weeks, he's caught 4 and 5 passes, but in 7 of his first 8 games this year, it was 2 or fewer receptions. He has a really pretty strong receiving role, frankly, but there are games that he can have 2 to 3 catches. The touchdowns are just so valuable for him, but we know that, basically any running back can have a game where they don't score just because it doesn't happen for one reason or another. I think that's less likely in this spot because Adam Thielen's not in there, and he's been such a big red zone player, and somebody that Kirk has relied on in close. Justin Jefferson's been fantastic too, but more of a big play downfield guy when he's made his biggest impacts. So you feel like if they get in close, they're almost even more likely than ever to be leaning on Cook. And then I guess if you're trying to create that path, the question becomes, can he be massively efficient? But then talking about Carolina, they haven't been like the worst team in the league against running backs this year, but they were terrible last year, and they're not good again this year. They've definitely given up their share of big running back games against. They gave up the 98-yard touchdown run to Rojo a few weeks back, and the big run to Leonard Fournette back in week 2. So both times they played Tampa, they've gotten smashed. They've certainly given up their share of big plays to running backs, and we know Minnesota's going to give Cook a ton of opportunities. So it's hard to get off of Cook for me.
Yeah, and I was kind of killing myself for last week. I didn't play Thielen, and in retrospect, I'm so mad that I didn't do that because that was just such an obvious leverage off of Cook. And I did play quite a bit of Cook, but I didn't obviously play 100% Cook. So it's like when you have a guy that's just such chalk like that, I just want to do a better job of identifying the pivots off of him and when I'm not including him in those lineups. And Thielen was just so obviously that because Justin Jefferson was very chalky last week. Thielen was not. And then obviously the results kind of echoed that. I do think with Thielen out this week, that Jefferson might be pretty chalky. If Jefferson, for whatever reason, doesn't end up being chalky, which I think is sort of hard to figure out how that could happen, but let's say it did, then yes, certainly he would be the way to play it because Cook can fail if they just aren't able to commit to the game script that they want. But if they are able to commit to that, and I think they probably will be, then he's just going to be such a smash. And so to pivot to another guy who's also chalky is kind of a bit nauseating. So I kind of am struggling to figure out like what the correct way to play it is. It could be Mike is ahead of me here. It could be Kyle Rudolph.
No, I would be Kyle Rudolph. Not Kyle Rudolph
because we have, I believe, Irv Smith's doubtful here.
Yes,
so you've got potential volume funneling to the tight end, Kyle Rudolph, man.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna ask, other than Kyle Rudolph, where would we pivot? Because I don't want to pivot to Kyle Rudolph.
You nominate someone else. I've already nominated.
I don't think there's anyone else. I mean, that's why
it's Chad Beebe's like the third guy here. It's not. I don't know that you can do it.
I mean, I think Rudolph's an okay option for all the reasons we're saying. It's basically a 2-man offense right here, and Irv Smith is hurt. So, yeah, I just don't want to play him. The way that I read that is they're just going to build more of their game plan around Dalvin Cook. I mean, I just don't see any way around that.
Naked Kirk, that's way grosser than Kyle Rudolph. I'm sorry, man. I can't imagine playing naked Kirk Cousins as a pivot off of the Cook chalk. Are you in on that, Gretch?
I don't explain yourself. Like what? You get a rush for 3 touchdowns?
You seem ready to quit the show after that.
What is it? I don't understand the path to that.
We need to move on before Ben signs up. All right, let's go to Carolina.
It's a concentrated passing game, so if you're going to play Kirk for some reason, you would not do it naked.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, how does Kirk get there without Justin Jefferson?
Yeah, he's going to spread it around to 40 options and then rush for 3 touchdowns. Anyway,
I love it. All right, I'm a little disappointed we're going to have Teddy Bridgewater back in this game because it was so nice for DJ Moore, PJ Walker actually liking to go downfield. DJ Moore For once, it seemed great that he was in this kind of downfield, higher A-dot role. But now I think it's probably bad for him. Might be better for Robbie Anderson. But then we have Curtis Samuel to worry about here, who, it's certainly possible that maybe I would have been too bullish on DJ Moore, and then Curtis Samuel would have broken my heart, even if we got PJ Walker, because Samuel just kind of seems to be the dude who's like, you don't know who he's going to murder that week. He's either going to murder Anderson or Cooper's or Moore's value. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Where are you at on this passing game? And let's just include Mike Davis in this because we need to get this done before midnight.
Yeah. I think, I don't really know what to do with Davis. His snaps haven't been as great. And they're big dogs here. You'd expect them to catch. Well, actually, they bumped back last week. They weren't great the week before. I think he's a reasonable bet to catch some passes here, but because they are dogs. But Samuel's a hard one to figure out. He's scored quite a few touchdowns lately, 5 in his last 5 games. But I also feel like we're going to get a bust Samuel game sooner than later. Like I don't necessarily buy that this is just going to stick forever. And then Moore's coming off the big game. So the play for DFS to me is Robbie Anderson, especially if he looks like the lowest owned. And it looks like that might be the case. And DJ Moore doesn't look like he's going to catch a lot of ownership either. And so maybe it's him too. But for me right now, the play is to be fading what Curtis Samuel's been doing, because it looks like it's probably more than it is.
Yeah. I think I'm with you. I think Anderson's probably the best play this week with Bridgewater back. It did seem like, although you would have basically anytime I thought I had a really good feel for this, it would kind of go the other way. But when you zoom out, it looked like Anderson was somewhere between the 1 to Moore's 2 or the 1A to Moore's 1B. But it never really has looked like with Teddy that Moore was the 1A and Anderson was the 1B. There's always been some lead for Anderson, and I think that probably remains the case. Even last week with Moore getting the huge game, Robbie Anderson had a route run on 86% of dropbacks, still maintaining a major role in the offense. So it was probably more to do with the quarterback than anything else this past week. And Anderson, although did not have a strong week 10, so there's a couple weeks here where it hasn't been Anderson. But if you go back to week 9, he had a whopper of 0.73, 30% of the targets with 13 targets, 41% of the air yards. So I think that if the field is kind of ready to let Robbie Anderson be pretty low owned, then I think that's a pretty sharp call. What's your interest on Mike Davis? I thought Mike Davis might be hurt a little bit by PJ Walker, but that really wasn't the case in terms of being able to get plenty of, high value work and stuff. So now he could potentially be looking at a fair amount of receiving work if Minnesota is able to dominate the game on the ground.
Yeah, I think he's a good play. I mean, I think his price is still up high enough that he probably doesn't catch big ownership. His snaps had dipped in week 10. But they came back up in week 11. And Rodney Smith was involved in the first drive of the game, I think he got their first carry last week, but only ended up playing 9 snaps. So it was really weird. At first I was like, we're heading for Mike Davis just in this 50% snap role now. But Davis's snaps went from, I don't have it right in front of me, I think it was like 51% back up to like 72%. If I had to guess what exactly the numbers were. He ended up running 20 times or 19 times and running the majority of the routes. And Rodney Smith only played the 9 snaps. So I think you're getting a little bit of a discount ownership wise on Davis right now, because he's back in, or he was at least for last week, even in a blowout game where they could have given, Smith more run. He was back in sort of the workhorse role. So
73% snaps, 15.7 expected points this last week. So pretty nice role for Mike Davis. All right. Unless there's anything else, I will move us to Indianapolis and Tennessee, where we've got Tennessee at Indianapolis with Indy the home favorite by 3, total of 51.5. Indy with the 27.25 team total to Tennessee's 24.25. Ben, one of the things that I try to lean on you the most for is to predict what's going to happen in this Indianapolis backfield. You seem to have some thoughts on Frank Reich and the way he deploys these guys. And at this point, I have no clue myself how this is going to go down. So how's it going down, Ben?
Yeah, he's been very game script dependent with his usage throughout his time in Indianapolis. But also lately it's been very hot hand dependent, obviously, because we started seeing Nyheim Hines get used in single back sets a couple of weeks back. He was just the hot hand. Obviously last week that was then Jonathan Taylor. I don't think we can trust really anything. But if I had to completely just guess at it, it would be that Jonathan Taylor leads again. Kind of a lot. Because this is a team that's heading for the playoffs. And they don't want Nyheim Hines to be their early down back or their, get tough yardage back. They need to get Jonathan Taylor going. And look, people have pointed out that Jordan Wilkins has been okay, but Jordan Wilkins isn't at all on Jonathan Taylor's level from a size speed perspective or really from a skill perspective, in my opinion. Even as bad as Jonathan Taylor's been, and everyone points out how bad his vision's been. He runs into his lineman. He's averaging 3.8 yards per carry. So is Wilkins, and everyone's saying Wilkins has been good. They've both averaged 3.8 yards per carry. Who's the guy that has the potential to average 4.5 yards per carry the rest of the year? I think it pretty clearly is Jonathan Taylor, the one that everyone is saying is so far failing to meet his expectations, and Wilkins is somehow getting talked up when he hasn't been any better really at all. So anyway, I think there's a reasonable chance that Taylor continue. Like they feel like they need to continue to work Taylor and rely on him and get him really going and his confidence up, whatever it is, whatever cliche you want to use. But as far as they're in their meeting rooms and stuff, they have to be thinking Jonathan Taylor has to be a big part of this offense. It can't just be Hines.
Yeah, and it was really nice to see the snap counts last week with Wilkins only getting 11% of snaps, Taylor 56. Taylor had 15.3 expected points, Wilkins just 3.5. So that's awesome. Love to see that. One thing I will note, though, Hines still played 33% of the snaps, had 12.8 expected points. He was very inefficient in the game, and he had a 15-yard reception, touchdown reception called back on a holding penalty. Also, Jonathan Taylor had runs of 20 yards, 9 yards, 7 yards, 6 yards, and 5 yards all called back on holding penalties, which is...
Jesus, I didn't realize there was that many. Yeah, he had a TD called back.
It was a crazy game in terms of the holding penalties, but the thing, one note as we look ahead to Tennessee is if, with the game script, I think it's going to have such an impact on which of these Colts running backs really pays off. And in some ways, I'm more interested in playing Taylor with Henry. And then if I wanted to play A.J. Brown, pair him with Hines. Because I do think that Hines, he has, obviously if this ends up being a little bit more of a shootout. Although actually you could play Henry and Hines together too. Because if Tennessee ends up winning the game and kind of dominating, then maybe Hines is the guy too. So maybe I'm sort of talking myself into Hines a little bit, just because he did have 12.3 expected points last week in a game, 12.8 in a game where Taylor had the breakout, but very close actually in terms of the workload. And Hines maybe a little bit more of a robust type of profile for being able to handle game scripts.
I think that's a fine. Hines isn't going anywhere. I think that's a fine way of looking at it. But broadly, I think Indy's just a really hard team to trust. Michael Pittman's the other one that we can talk about. Looks like their most valuable receiver and had the big 45-yard touchdown early and then only gets 2 targets the rest of the way. They're spreading targets so much. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 guys with multiple targets last week. No one over 6 targets. So 9 dudes within 2 to 6 targets. And that's just kind of what we've been seeing from them fairly consistently. So I don't want to play a lot of players on Indianapolis in any fantasy format. They're just not a very good fantasy option right now.
Yeah, and I had been excited about Pittman. Saved his day last week by getting in the end zone, but he had just 3 targets for 12 air yards, 9% target share, 5% air yard share. So that was, that hurts when you think that Pittman is potentially kind of emerging as the number 1 option in the passing game. and then it's a T.Y. Hilton resurgence game. So don't love the idea of having to go back to Pittman here. Although I will say Pat Thorman noted this in his snaps and pace column at Establish a Run as this being a pace up game. And I've gotten so used to the Colts being one of these slow paced teams, but he's noted that they've been playing faster recently, and the Tennessee Titans have been playing fast all year. So there is maybe a little bit of sneaky play volume available in this game. Something to keep in mind. I don't have too much else on this game. Anything else you wanted to note?
The Tennessee passing game has been real rough since Taylor Lewan went down. They were a little bit better last week, but a big part of that was a 50-yard completion to Corey Davis. And they've always kind of thrived on big plays, but it really was just sort of that one play, and it got Tannehill to like 270 passing yards. But besides that, I think he's failed to hit 235 in the other 4 games since Luan went down. And his pass volume hasn't been there. I think he's maxed out at like 32 attempts. They are pretty clearly in full-on Henry mode right now and not trying to drop Tannehill back too much because they don't think they can protect him, is my read on it. The Tennessee pass game is a no for me, which includes Corey Davis, who's, I think some people would point out, has been I think he has more yards than A.J. Brown right now and really close in targets. Might have more receptions and just a couple fewer targets, and it's really just touchdowns that separated them. And I'll just kind of note with Davis that a lot of his yards have come in a few games, some matchups that have worked in their favor. And I know one of his 100-yard games, he had like 4 or 5 catches in garbage time that were just 10-yard hitches, and they were playing way off, and Tannehill just kept throwing to him over and over. I wrote about it in Signals that week. I know back in week 1, it was the same play action drag route every single play they ran in week 1. So a couple of his big games have just been like one thing they've gone back to multiple times. I think if you're actually watching this, you're seeing that A.J. Brown draws way more attention from defenses and is still thriving through that. He's a tough guy to sit in seasonal leagues. He's not somebody that I really want to play through this matchup in DFS, though. But yeah, Tennessee passing game is basically A.J. Brown or bust for me. Yep, I'm with you there. Okay, moving to Buffalo and the Chargers. This game's in Buffalo. Buffalo is favored by 4.5, total of 53. Given Buffalo team total of 28.75. The Chargers 24.25. As you know, this is a big total. This is going to be kind of a fun game stack type of environment, I think. Buffalo passes way above expectations. The Chargers kind of hurt us a little bit 2 weeks ago against the Dolphins by kind of reverting to a run-heavy approach, but we got them back pass-heavy, fun game script type of vibe with the Jets this past week. Hopefully we can get both these teams throwing at each other a ton. It does seem like, looking at projections and stuff, that the more popular way to play this will be going Buffalo with, Chargers bring back. I'm still fine with Herbert personally. Like, I don't really quite understand why the team total is so low here. And Leone was talking through the projections, just saying like it's hard, given that we don't have a huge sample on Herbert, to project him for the efficiency that he's shown. But I kind of like the idea of like, okay, I'll just keep riding this efficiency that he is showing, and maybe he's awesome because he looks like, when I watch the game, like Herbert's already one of my favorite quarterbacks in the league to watch. I love watching him, and I love playing him in DFS, and I think I'm just going to do that some more this week. Where are you at, Ben?
Yeah, I think I'm going to play both quarterbacks in this game. I think it's going to be the clear favorite game, or it should be. I guess I haven't really looked at the ownership a ton, but I'm assuming that these two quarterbacks will both be reasonably owned. We have a lot of interesting things in this game. We have no John Brown, so you can talk about Buffalo's secondary receiving options. Gabriel Davis's role has really expanded without John Brown on the field. The few times that's happened, I think he's a really interesting, cheaper receiver. We have potentially Eckler coming back. He's questionable. So is Kalen Ballage. And I think sort of the consensus I'm seeing in some projections is that like Ballage is going to play and Eckler's not. But right now they seem both as likely to play as the other. So I don't really know what to do with this backfield, which is one of the backfields that generates so many high-value touches that you want pieces of it if you know someone's going to be a lead back, especially in a game with a 50-plus team total. They're going to catch passes. They're going to get red zone work. It's a very valuable backfield to lead, which is how we wound up with Kalen Ballage having value this season. And then obviously you have Keenan Allen, Stephon Diggs. They're just two of the top 5 receivers in the NFL. There's so many things here that are very interesting to me. The only it's probably been debunked. I think I've seen stuff on it. The only thing that I'm thinking with Herbert is he's going from LA all the way up to Buffalo for a 1 Eastern game. You got the body clock narrative. The weather doesn't look like it's going to be bad. Late November, Buffalo, you can get snow and everything. I was looking at it. It doesn't look like it's going to be terrible. I don't know. I'll leave that to the experts, but
no, I think it's supposed to be pretty good.
Okay.
So I think a little bit of wind, but nothing crazy.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a scenario where Herbert can be strong, and that's probably what's impacting the spread more than anything. It's just that it's a long travel game for them. I mean, I don't know.
He's young, I think he can manage it. That's an interesting angle on it. If we were to lose Ballage and Eckler doesn't end up playing, and the latest report was that there's a chance Eckler can play. So I think your characterization is correct that we probably won't get Eckler, but more likely to get Ballage. But if we get neither, what is your read on that? Tremaine Pope, Josh Kelly. My kind of thinking is that it's sort of anyone but Kelly at this point. It feels like they've sort of lost confidence in him.
Yep.
But it would be a little bit nerve-wracking to play Tremaine Pope, especially after 2 weeks ago. He was basically – I don't think he had a single offensive snap 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, but he worked back in last week. If Ballage is out, the way you said it is the way I'm thinking of it. Anybody but Kelly at this point is kind of what the team has told us. But I do think in that scenario, Kelly would play more. He just wouldn't lead because they don't seem to want him to lead in any scenario. But it would impact Pope in a negative way, I think, particularly in the green zone, because that is one area where Kelly has seemed to continue to maintain some value for fantasy perspective. And they've seemed to continue to use him as their bigger back and in close. So I don't know that Pope would have, multiple touchdown potential. He's kind of a smaller back, but he would probably catch some passes and be a little bit interesting. They're both min priced. So I'd lean Pope, but
One note I'd say is if Eckler gets ruled out, especially, I would throw out some last minute offers for him in dynasty leagues. I do think that, to Ben's point about there being a lot of value in this backfield, there really is, and Eckler has a very strong chance, I think, to lock up a much higher percentage of that value than we've seen, than maybe from anyone but Ballage, and he's a lot better than Ballage. So
this is a good point on Herbert, real quick from Permar. He smashed in Miami. He also smashed in was it Tampa? In his second start. Yeah. So he's had a couple games already on the East Coast. One of those was an afternoon game, but yeah, to my whole, body clock point, I'm not necessarily scared of that.
Yeah. And I'm not, again, I'm just sort of confused. I obviously don't want to just go against Vegas without any reason for doing it. So I'm sort of would like to figure out why the team total is low. I mean, 24.25 is pretty low for what I would have expected, if I was just going to take a guess at it. It's lower.
I mean, some of it's just Buffalo's a better team, right?
Yeah.
You can't. Home team gets 3 points, and then it's an extra point and a half. The total's 53. It's still high. Yeah.
On the Buffalo backfield, any read on how to play that situation?
Yeah, what I wrote is, do we care about Moss Singletary? I have Zach Moss in a lot of places. I think he's more valuable pretty clearly because he's been getting the green zone work consistently. So he's the one that has the 2 touchdown upside. And that's kind of been the case for a while. But we've also seen so many games where neither of them gets enough touches because they just go pass heavy. So it's hard to care about the backfield.
It is.
Again, it's a split backfield with not a lot of high value touches. So that's when I tend to avoid.
Yeah, because you've got a team that has not really. If you look at yards per route run for these running backs, even guys like TJ Yeldon, which is the point of TJ Yeldon is to catch passes, and he has a low yards per route run, and it's because they don't really throw to the running back. I think it's similar to Houston, where you're just not really going to want the receiver. They're just not going to throw the running back a lot, so that hurts Singletary. And you also have Josh Allen stealing goal line rushes. So that's going to hurt Moss. I do think that if you're playing one of them, normally I would lean towards the receiving running back in a situation like this, but I think if I was going to play one, I'd try to get the touchdown. You got a team that's at home, favored. So I would play Moss of the two, but that's more of like a season-long thing, I think. All right, moving to Miami and the Jets, unless you've got anything else?
No.
All right, so Miami is an away favorite here. Jets at home, but Miami favored by 7, total of 44.5. The Dolphins have a team total of 25.75 to the Jets 18.75. Very, very putrid here. We do not have Salvon Ahmed. We do not probably have Myles Gaskin, although that is at least still somewhat in play. What are we doing at running back with the Dolphins?
I don't know. You wrote finally DeAndre Washington. You're
that was supposed to have a question mark after it.
Okay. I won't touch it. I won't touch it. Tua has negatively impacted the passing game in all phases, and we were just talking about with Allen. I feel strongly, and I don't really, other than the rushing angle, you can explain it that way. I don't really have a great way of explaining why, but I feel strongly that quarterbacks dictate the running back target rate, just from an experience standpoint. I guess a tacit, I don't know. I can't really explain why. The rushing thing is easily explainable. They scramble instead of dumping off, but it's just so clear that some quarterbacks, when you look at it from a weekly basis, when you write a column like Signals over several years, some quarterbacks target running backs and that stays, some don't. Tua hasn't since he took over. The high value touch is completely cratered in the Miami offense. Last week, Ahmed caught a few more passes, and I wrote about it in Signals this week. I don't have the exact numbers, but a chunk of them were after Fitzpatrick took over late. Tua got benched. Devontae Parker had a touchdown and had a strong receiving day. The majority of his receiving yardage came after Fitzpatrick took over. It was 40-something yards after Fitzpatrick took over. He had like 18 yards in 2.5 quarters with Tua. He did have the touchdown with Tua, but he was not on his way to a good day until Fitzpatrick took over. We do have Tua questionable now. He has a jammed thumb from Wednesday practice. If he sits, then Miami gets interesting. Miami's passing game is interesting. Whoever their running back is gets interesting. Because when Fitzpatrick was the quarterback, we had a ton of high-value touches. We had a ton of running back targets, and we had more value for the receivers as well. So it makes Parker more interesting. But if Tua's in the lineup, I don't want to play pretty much anyone from Miami.
Yeah, we do have Pete in the chat here. So I did want to mention Patrick Laird because I think that if anyone can tell us who's going to get running back touches here, it's probably Patrick Laird. It probably won't be Patrick Laird, but he could let us know if it's DeAndre Washington or if it's Matt Breida. So Patrick Laird, very important to note in this game as someone who might know what's going to happen at the running back position. But I'm in agreement with you about the Fitzpatrick versus Tua thing. I think that one thing that struck me about this game is that maybe it doesn't really matter. Pete did not appreciate my joke. Oh no. One thing I think that's kind of interesting is that against the Jets, maybe we just don't care about who the running back is, because the way to beat the Jets and the way the Jets for some reason want teams to beat them is through the air. They do not want teams to run on them. They want teams to pass on them. We saw this with the Chiefs. We saw this last week with the Chargers, where if you want to target anything, you want to target passing games against the Jets. If we get Fitzpatrick in this game, then all of a sudden, Devontae Parker looks pretty interesting. Got Mike Gesicki in this weird, field stretching tight end role to where, he is potentially a little bit interesting as a dart throw. Again, much more so with Fitzpatrick. But I think that's where it gets kind of interesting. On the Jets side, it's almost too gross to talk about. I have Mims as someone I noted. You noted he gets kind of these prayer yards. But yeah, I mean, he has pretty solid underlying volume. He hasn't been able to connect like Brashad Perriman for TDs, but he's someone that I'm kind of interested in. I think I'm going to have to start Frank Gore in a dynasty league where I'm out Gaskin and I'm definitely out McCaffrey. So that's going to be disgusting. And I don't want to do that in DFS. I imagine you're not that interested in that either. Anything to talk about on the Jets?
The per yards comment was just late last week. Flacco was just chucking it up to Mims in one-on-one coverage. Like the joke about prayer yards couldn't have been more. There couldn't have been a better example of that than Mims last week. I like Mims a lot. I played him. I was closely watching him because I had the potential to make a lot of money if he would have caught a few more of those. But really, it was just a lot of bombs late in the game. I do still think that says, okay, between him and Perriman, who's the guy we think can win one-on-ones when we're trying to come back in a game? And they did come back in that game, and it was Mims. They kept going back to him over and over. At the very end of the game, with a chance to win, they threw it up to him in the end zone, and he kind of got interfered with a little bit on one of the chances they had. Certainly was a lot of for me sweating him in DFS. A lot of saying, "Oh, that's Mims," and then it just didn't work because they were fairly aware of it. But it is, it's clear from what we saw that they think he's their go-to guy more or less down the field. Crowder hasn't been as effective with Flacco. Perriman's been pretty efficiency heavy. He's had a couple big touchdowns, but I'm not really buying that he's going to consistently be good. It seems like if you're going to play one of them, it's Mims, just because that's the guy that has racked up volume, even if it isn't high efficiency volume. I'll say it does feel like it's a prayer yard type situation. One note I'll say though that I saw this week over at Sharp Football. The Jets all year, they've been really good against, to your point, they've been really good against rushing. But over the last 6 weeks, suddenly they've been a lot worse. It's weird. They're seventh for the season in rushing success rate against. They're 28th in the last 6 weeks. There's not he has a tool over their trending performance. There's not a lot of teams that have. There's almost none that have that big of a difference from their season-long numbers and their just recent performance numbers. So just over the last, I say 6 weeks because a lot of the data scientists that have looked at this have said that 6 weeks is typically the best sample you want to look at. Over the last 6 weeks, the Jets have actually been one of the bottom 5 teams in the league in rushing success rate against. So they might be more inviting to the run now than they were.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So all the more reason for
the Jets just suck.
Here.
They did one thing well, which was stop the run, and now they don't do that well anymore either.
Yeah, they suck. All right. So we might need to know who the Miami running back is after all. All right. Moving to New Orleans and Denver. This is in Denver. New Orleans is favored, though, by 6. Total of 42.5. New Orleans has a team total of 24.25. Denver at 18.25. Taysom Hill definitely had a major impact last week on the entire offense, as you would expect. The obvious impact for one was that Alvin Kamara is just getting a lot less targets, which is very, very predictable. No one would have thought otherwise, really. But the game script also had an impact too, because they're in this blowout win. I do think maybe that's kind of be hard to kind of parse that out again this week because they're set up for another big win here against Denver. But let's say we get a competitive environment. Where are you at on Kamara? Because, sometimes you see the dual threat quarterbacks open up rushing efficiency. Kamara already an incredibly efficient rusher. So, you could kind of be maybe similar to what we saw from Mike Davis last week where, you're not getting as many dump offs, but actually there's some value to be had on the ground, maybe some high value touches, because Kamara's snaps were way down last week. And I believe Murray had a season high in snaps last week. And if this game's competitive, I don't think that will be the case. So how much do you think Kamara can kind of get back to the elite running back profile that we were used to him having?
Well, I'll actually kind of push back on that a little bit. I don't know that the game script impacted it as much as it may seem on its face. I mean, Kamara was still getting carries in their last drive. He got one. It was mostly Murray late. I'll grant that. But Murray got the first carry of the game on their second snap. And it was interesting to me how much he was playing early. And then another thing we typically see when there's blowouts is the routes per dropback don't dip as much when this type of split happens because the team isn't throwing as much late. And that was the case here. I mean, like Taysom Hill threw a little bit more late because they were trying to work him, but a lot of it was running late. And it wasn't just the snaps with Kamara. He had 37% routes, easily a season low. His previous season low was 51%, but he's more often than not 70% or higher in terms of his routes. And he was down at 37%. I don't know what the hell that was about, but it was, even with Murray. And then again, you go back to Murray getting a carry on the second play of the game and starting. He's more of a straight line runner. Maybe they're just like, read options and stuff. We have the speed quarterback that can get to the edge, and we want a between the tackles guy for those types of looks. I don't think that will stick, but it was a very weird usage. It wasn't just that Taysom Hill wasn't throwing to the backs as much. It was that Kamara wasn't even running routes.
Yeah, and Murray ran a route on the exact same percentage, 37% of dropbacks. And that's high for Murray. It's not as big of a jump up for Murray as it was a drop down for Kamara, but some of that was explained by Murray getting more playing time, but some of that was just there were less running back routes. So again, kind of one of these situations where it's like part of it's driven by what they're doing with Taysom and part of it's driven by what they were doing between Latavius Murray and Alvin Kamara. And man, if it wasn't game script related, if this was like a deployment thing that maybe we now see them more in like a 50-50 type split going forward, that could be really bad on top of the Taysom Hill effect that, we knew we were going to get.
Yeah. And I would say that I don't think that's likely to stick. And maybe this is just a game where they gave Kamara a little bit of a breather. Weird things do happen in NFL seasons. We've seen this type of thing. I haven't seen it with Kamara before in his whole career, basically. I mean, he certainly was in more limited roles in certain splits earlier in his career with Ingram and whatnot, but not just like this type of huge 1 week drop off, which you do sometimes see with some backs where they're just like, okay, we gave him a little bit of a breather. Like Derrick Henry snaps will sometimes drop or Todd Gurley. Some of these like grinders, sometimes they won't play as much, but you don't see it with Kamara. But it could just have been a weird thing. But it's weird in that, like we're saying, it came on a week where they used a new quarterback. You can kind of explain it a little bit by saying Murray's this between the tackles grinder. We don't usually use Kamara that way. Again, I don't think it's going to stick, but yeah, like the way that you framed it is right. This could be really like it could be the start of something where we're like, wow, Kamara's not Kamara anymore. That's why the hell did that happen? Like there is more downside right now than I want to admit because I have him everywhere.
Yeah, and PMAR's pointing out that if Hill drops back, he was really locking into Thomas, but then less likely to check down, and that's something we did expect to happen. Where you often see these rushing quarterbacks. Brittany checking in on me here in the background. You do see the rushing quarterbacks that just don't check down to the. And you were talking earlier about the quarterbacks driving running back targets. Like, watch Tom Brady play, and then tell me that that's not the case. Like,
and Drew
Brees, exactly. So some guys love throwing to the running backs, and other guys typically don't. Deshaun Watson had the touchdown to Duke Johnson on yesterday's slate, but normally that's not his.
That was
and the pro sites too. So.
That was a downfield one. The pro size one was a design play. I mean, the other thing is I think the quarterback dictates a lot of the running back receiving efficiency. We don't really need to get into this a ton, but if you go back and look at Drew Brees' career, pretty much every running back that's played with him has been a way more efficient receiver when they've played with Drew Brees than they were on any other team. Darren Sproles, all these guys. And that's the other thing with Tua and like Fitzpatrick and Gaskin had this great connection. Tua's not targeting the running backs, and the catch rate has plummeted for running backs. It's why with high value touches, I look at receptions and not targets for running backs, because I do think there is an element of that inside an offense where some of the targets to running backs are significantly more valuable depending on who the quarterback is. So it's something to think about. And I don't think Hill's going to be the right guy to get the ball down to his running back on time in the situation where he can catch 80% of the balls like Brees has always done with every running back in his career.
Yeah, agreed. On the Denver side, I mean, the backfield, I don't even think is really that interesting to the point. Like, I don't really want to talk about it. They have last week you had some really nice efficiency, but typically that is what you need from Denver. You need one of the guys to be super efficient to really pay off because they have a low volume role. Both guys have low volume roles, and it's not an offense that you want to really get pieces in the first place. So I don't know, unless you have other notes. I did want to mention fact that KJ Hamler saw his routes fall off last week in a way that I found concerning. He was down at 65% routes per dropback after being at 92% in week 10. And what we saw is that Tim Patrick jumped up from 57% in week 10 up to 81% this past week. So you had a little bit of a flip back there where Hamler had been getting more and more work. Back in week 9, he was at 75% and Tim Patrick at 84%. Then you had Patrick trend down, Hamler trending back up. Hamler had passed to Sean Hamilton. So it just seemed like one of these clear trends where Hamler's getting more and more work and looked to be establishing himself then as the number 2 to Jerry Jeudy. But last week, pretty significant step back to where Patrick actually led the team in routes and significantly ahead of KJ Hamler. So, there were not that many dropbacks, only 31 dropbacks in the game. So we are talking about like a raw routes of just 5 over Patrick to Hamler. So maybe this is ultimately just a little noisy, but
I think it's interesting to your point that Hamler was building towards something and he's probably not. And this is not a passing game where if you're not sure on the role that you want to be playing anyone. Basically, we have Jerry Jeudy, who's had, I think, 130 plus air yards in 4 straight. That I can buy into a little bit. I'm willing to be like, okay, I could play Jerry Jeudy in some DFS slates or whatever. I don't have him really anywhere in seasonal. But that's one where like I'm a little bit interested. But beyond him, I'm not really willing to play anyone. Patrick had the 119 yards. We should know for anyone who didn't see this or didn't read signals, and I don't know if you mentioned this on Stat Chasing, but had a 61-yard catch on the last play of the game. They had a 4th down, 4 seconds left. Instead of punting, they rolled out and Drew Lock chucked it up. Normally they throw those out of bounds. He threw it in the field of play for some reason. Tim Patrick ran under it, caught it, gained 61 yards on the play. It was a total fluke play where Miami is selling out to try to sack him within 4 seconds so they could get a turnover on downs and take a shot to the end zone to try to win or to force overtime. And he chucked it up in the field of play, and it's one-on-one coverage because like they're not trying to gain yardage, and gets a 61-yard completion. That was Tim Patrick's whole day. I mean, that was more than half of his receiving yards. So don't go chasing his 119 yards.
What if Jeudy is out per Mike? Is Jeudy is questionable?
I just don't like. I don't want to play Denver against. I want the Saints defense is my response to that. I mean, Drew Lock's I don't think very good, and the Saints have a pretty decent defense. Taysom Hill's going to slow down the pace significantly for New Orleans. I don't want to play anyone on Denver at all.
Yeah, that seems fair. I'd probably still take my chance on KJ Hamler. Just, if Judy's out and you need the wide receiver in like a season-long league and you don't have another option, I'd still rather take a chance on KJ Hamler. Just like if you look back to week 10, he had 10 targets. He had 10 targets in week 9 too. It really did seem like he was coming on. And so if I was going to take a stab, I'd take a stab on a guy that I thought was a really good prospect. I just think he's probably the more talented of the two. It's all bet against last week's performance. But I generally agree that it's not a situation to target. All right, moving to San Francisco at the Rams. The Rams here are home favorites by 6.5, total of 44.5. That gives the Rams a team total of 25.5. And the Niners just 19, low total there. You say that you do not know what to make of the Rams and don't like this game very much, Ben. So where do you want to kick things off on a game that you're not too psyched about?
Yeah, I mean, against the Seahawks a couple of weeks ago, the Rams used more 2 tight ends. Cooper Kupp snaps and routes dipped, which we that's another example of sort of the Kamara thing I was talking about earlier, where it happens sometimes. It happened late last year. He had a game where he had like 29% routes just out of the blue when they were using their tight ends more. And I thought maybe we were trending towards that. And then this past week, completely flipped that on its head. Very pass heavy against the Bucs, way more pass heavy than we've seen from the Rams. I think they entered last week with more rush attempts and passes on the season. I know they had certainly been there as of maybe like 3 or 4 weeks ago. They were a team that was running more than they were passing, which is not really how they played in previous seasons. But even against the Seahawks, they ran a ton, and that's a team that everyone passes on. Against the Bucs, they came out passing very heavy, and Kupp was out there a ton. It was Kupp Woods day. The week before in Seahawks, it was Josh Reynolds day. Remember? Like he led their team in volume. And then it was back to, okay, Kupp and Woods. And this seems normal, but it hasn't been normal lately. I still think, you have Kupp and Woods in seasonal or whatever you play them. I'm not saying, not to trust them, but it is weirdly inconsistent what they're going to do week to week. And some of that's probably smart from a real football perspective. Sean McVay's, playing matchups, doing things. I think his plan to come out and throw heavily against Tampa Bay obviously worked very well. And it's not something they've done a ton of, like I said. So that's fine. That was good to see. That might not occur again here. And then they're playing San Fran. Divisional opponents know each other. You'd think we'd be able to get some read on them, except for the fact that earlier this year, whatever the Rams tried did not work. They lost. They were favored on the road in San Francisco and got beat outright, and weren't very good offensively. Very, very poor. So I would actually expect them to change whatever they did before, based on the fact that they've been kind of changing and tailoring lately to their opponents. What they changed to, I have no idea.
One thing that I'm interested in this game is Gerald Everett. If Tyler Higbee misses, Everett has been targeted on 22% of his routes this season. We just never get a full Gerald Everett game because Higbee's pretty good. He also, he's been targeted on 19.5% of his routes. He was targeted a very high percentage last year. So I think both these tight ends can play, but when you have Higbee or Everett out, the other one is really set up to smash. It's a much less gross situation than the Kyle Rudolph or Smith situation. So, man, if we don't have Higbee here, I'm actually pretty excited about Everett. Just, you need a lot less out of the tight end position, and you got a guy who's going to be probably running a bunch more routes than he typically does on the season. Everett only running a route on 39% of dropbacks, Higbee at 48%. And they don't really have a tight end behind these guys. It's just Johnny Munt, who's not really involved when one of these other guys is missing, at least from a pass-catching perspective. So, that's the biggest note that I have, and I agree with you. Otherwise, it can be a little bit hard to predict. I mean, it's one of these things where Josh Reynolds is the deep threat in this offense, but, a lot of weeks he's only got an 8 out of about 10. So, he's a bit of a tough dart throw guy because he's not even running that deep downfield as the deep threat. Woods last week had the bigger game, but didn't run as many routes, ran more routes. So on a target per route run basis, it was actually Cooper Kupp who really, really jumped out, but only ran 42 routes to Woods' not 49.
Yeah, and I'm kind of just, like I said, I'm playing those guys if I have them in seasonal leagues, but and maybe Henderson if I need to. If I have to pick a running back in this backfield, it's Henderson right now. But I'm not playing probably anybody from this game in DFS. There's probably opportunities to get leverage, low ownership, any of those things. I just think it's, and one of them is probably going to pay off, right? But I think it's too thin to. I think you can sink your lineup that way a little bit. I mean, I really do, and it doesn't necessarily seem that way with Kupp and Woods weekly lines, and I'll probably look stupid when one of them has a normal 10-target game and does really well, but I don't trust them.
Yeah, that's fair. So on the San Francisco side, man, it's like really tough as we sit here on Friday afternoon to try and figure out how to play this because we don't, Ayuk, I think, is still in the mix to be active. He needs to come off the COVID list. I'm not sure about Debo.
Debo's going to play. Just saw
Debo's going to play.
Half hour ago or so, yeah.
Mostert's a possibility to play. Jordan Reed could soak up some of the volume. So,
and Coleman's out was the other part of that update that came while we were recording. But yeah, Coleman's out. Debo's going to play. He's got the hammy. Ayuk is, I think, questionable still or still on the COVID list. But Ayuk is the one that I don't know if it'll be this week to use him, but he's the one that I really want to be long on right now. And people don't realize how good he's been. He's been so good for 3 consecutive games. And yes, Debo missed some of that, but like he's very clearly trending towards being such a huge part of their passing game in the future. Yeah. And Kittle's still out. So even with Debo back, I think they can coexist. And Ayuk's sort of the downfield. Like he's basically dominating any targets that aren't jet sweeps tip passes to Debo, right? Like any kind of drop back and look downfield, he's been a very clear dominant target share type guy and productive, efficient with that. So
what I like about Ayuk is that he's been used as kind of like just a pigeonholed deep threat wide receiver for some weeks. He's been just like a pure alpha wide receiver doing everything. He's been used in kind of the Debo role at times. So they have been experimenting with his deployment, and he's been pretty good in every role. And so I agree. I think long-term, very exciting on Brandon Ayuk. I think if Ayuk ends up missing and we just get Deebo Samuel, that's pretty bullish for Samuel. Samuel has a weighted targets per route run of 0.41 on the season, which is pretty solid. The bigger thing is that he racks up catches with a targets per route run of 22%. An ADOT on the season, I like literally want to double check this afterwards, but 2.4. Deebo Samuel's ADOT of 2.4.
Yeah, no, it's right. He had 2 games where the 6 target, 6 catch, like 60 reception game, and the 5 target, 5 catch, 60 reception game where his air yards were negative. Every single target was behind the line of scrimmage in both games. I wrote about it on Signals, and I went back and watched them. It was all the tip passes, or they do the thing where they motion him, snap it while he's mid-motion, and he breaks back to the same side, and they just swing it to him right away. It's still behind the line of scrimmage. Like, literally had, like, negative 50 air yards in one game. I mean, or I think it was, like, negative 30. He had 6 targets that averaged negative 5 yards, and it was, like, negative 30 air yards. I mean, that's where all of his targets have come. Not all of them, but for those couple games at least. And so, yeah, that's why his ADOT's so low.
Yeah. It'll be interesting if Mostert and Samuel's back, because Mostert was being used in some of that, short yardage passing role that we didn't really expect heading into the season, which was really nice for Mostert. But with Samuel, maybe he's used less that way. But, a lot up in the air here. I do think Mostert's kind of interesting with Coleman out if he ends up going. But,
yeah.
All right, moving to Kansas City at Tampa Bay. Kansas City favored by 3.5. Total of 56. Nice, juicy shootout potential here with 29.75 team total for Kansas City, 26.25 team total for Tampa Bay. You have a note here that I don't even want to repeat. How do you see this backfield, Ben?
Yeah, I think we know what the rules sort of are, right? Like, Fournette seems to play on the passing downs. Even though he had 3 drops last week, like, it's not up to us to decide what we think they should do. And this feels like a Fournette game because, Kansas City's offense is going to put up points, and Tampa Bay is going to want to throw to keep pace. So it's hard to trust Ronald Jones as much as I love him, and I have him in a lot of leagues, and I am playing him in a main event playoff game where I don't have a lot of great options, but I don't feel good about it, and I wouldn't be if I had good options.
Yeah, this is a really tough spot to trust Ronald Jones in, because it's not just the third downs. It's like anytime they're in a hurry up, or like even sort of like hurry up adjacent type of scripts. Like, so what I mean is, like, if it's the fourth quarter with 8 minutes left and they're down by 10, Fournette's probably playing like 60 to 80% of those snaps.
But it might even be middle of the second quarter. They've given up touchdowns in the last 2 drives, and they decide they want to go pass heavy for a drive, and they do a kind of an up tempo drive. Then Fournette plays the whole
Fournette's playing the whole drive.
It happens a lot.
Yep. And it's absolutely brutal for Jones. Like, he can just end up with, like he could have 10, 11 touches, and a lot of them are first down runs that don't get blocked very well. So, what's funny? Do you remember, I've said this a couple times, but do you remember a couple years ago, the big thing with David Johnson? It was the year he was coming back from all the injuries, and he was the first year that he wasn't very good. And the big stat that we all talked about in the fantasy community was 1st and 10 runs up the middle. And it, like, people were. This was the Mike McCoy year?
No, it was Byron Leftwich, Ronald Jones' current coordinator, and he's been calling the same thing. If you watch the Bucs, they run 1st and 10 up the middle every time, and it's hard to look it up. I don't have the directionality access. Somebody else probably does, but their 1st and 10 rush rate is high, but it's not like the highest in the league. But it's between the tackles every time, and the couple times that they've done differently, it's actually tended to work. But I think it's something that's so clearly seen on film. They gain 1 or 2 yards every freaking time, and then they throw on 2nd and 8 or 2nd and 9.
Yeah.
And, you can talk about, like, I don't even understand how Jones has been an efficient runner this season at all. Like, I think that speaks very well to him, because he's been deployed in a way that a couple years ago, we were blaming all of David Johnson's rushing inefficiency on the exact same deployment, same coordinator in Arizona at that time. Byron Leftwich needs to figure out how to call something other than a dive between the guards on 1st and 10. It's atrocious.
Yeah, I agree. We got some comments here that, maybe they go out with a run heavy game plan. I don't think they do. Just like this is, the offense really does, I think, run through Brady outside of there's been 2 weeks ago. I mean, 2 weeks ago, they still didn't really run the offense through Jones. They just didn't bench him after he fumbled. And then he has the 98-yard run, but it wasn't like they were just leaning on him in a way. I don't know. I think this is probably going to be a pretty pass-heavy, Fournette-centric game script. Obviously, I would love to see if they just try to run fast and run Jones and, whatever, keep the ball out of, maybe run slow and keep the ball out of hands. But
how do you handicap the passing weapons? Because I did notice that they got more concentrated with their routes. Scott Miller is like completely gone now. It's pretty it's what we would have expected them trending towards. AB, Evans, Godwin, Gronk. Cameron Brate still runs some routes, but for the most part, those are their 4 guys that are running routes, and they were mixing in both Brady and Miller for a little bit. AB came on, and it cut into Gronk 1 week, it cut into Brown 1 week, but we're trending towards just those 4 guys. And Evans and Godwin have never really gotten hit. Their routes have stayed really consistent, but we're trending towards those 4 guys running 80% plus routes per drop back. How do you handicap the value for fantasy for those 4?
Yeah, we got Henry Muto in the chat here, who excellent high stakes player, and we were talking some weeks back about he's had Antonio Brown, a lot of exposure to him on his high stakes teams. We weren't into it, but yeah, we got to take the L on that because Antonio Brown has a weighted targets per route run of 0.73. That's like a wide receiver 1, borderline elite level weighted targets per route run, meaning when this guy's out on the field running routes, he's getting a lot of targets, 28% targets per route run, and he's getting a bunch of air yards to go with it. He has an 8 out of 11.5. So he's like kind of in that where when you see ADOTs between like 10 and 12, that's kind of that primary wide receiver type of role typically. And Brown getting used on some shorter stuff, but he also gets some of the deeper shots too. So
do you think he's the most valuable of the 4?
Yeah, I do, because when he's going to get out there, Brady's looking for him like first read, like I am throwing to Antonio Brown on this play. You're going to get like 4 of those. And then you probably get, like a deep shot on top. And then, he had 13 targets last week. So if it ends up being a pretty pass heavy game script, but then
they were bad.
You can get over 10.
They were bad. And he was bad. He had 4.4 yards per target on those 13 targets. He had 57 yards on 13 targets. It was part of the reason that Tampa Bay was terrible in the passing game and Brady looked old. I'm not saying we shouldn't take the L because Brown has clearly gotten a ton of volume, but I do think there is some possibility that they're like, okay, we tried to make Brown or that like Arians comes back to Brady and says, look, you really obviously love throwing to Antonio Brown, but our passing offense has been worse over the last few weeks because you're doing that.
Well, that's a good point. Mike Evans only had a 6.1 yards per target, and Chris Godwin was at 5.3. So the entire passing offense sucked. So, what needs to happen for Brown to fail is probably that they just don't put him out there, because I think that's the way they control it. It's like one of those things where I'm convinced that Hunter Renfrow has played a lot less this year because they just know Carr will target him when he's out on the field. And it's just like, well, let's just not play him. And I think that that's probably the way, if Arians does feel that way, that they just limit Brown's playing time. I mean, Miller did run around on 24% of dropbacks last week, which was actually more than he ran in week 10, a higher percentage than week 10. So the answer is just they play Scotty Miller, who I think Arians probably likes more than he likes Antonio Brown, or at least he likes the like for Scotty Miller certainly much higher than Tom Brady has. So it sounds like you're on one of the other 2. Which guy would you prefer between?
I want to play Brown.
Do you?
I
okay.
have to play any of them. Yeah, I think the volume is worth trusting. I just do think it's a little quick to be like, Brown was a clearly great option. And Henry makes a great point in the chat here too, that he's had multiple deep shots that I believe it's 2 that could have been.
One did hit him on the hands.
One was wide open. The first game or the second game, and Brady just threw it over the back of his head, like way missed him. I mean, it should have been an easy touchdown for a long TD. But
part of the problem here is I think Brady is pretty close to done. Yeah.
So that's tough. But yeah, this is another interesting question. How are we playing Pittsburgh, Baltimore? I have Mark Andrews in a lot of spots, and I have Gronk backing him up in one. I think I'm just going to play Gronk, but in that scenario, I had Will Fuller last night and played against Jordan Akins, and so off to a good start in a main event playoff matchup. So it's almost like risking that 0 with Andrews is pretty dumb. It would feel like, but that Pittsburgh Baltimore game feels like it's not even going to be an amazing. It's a divisional smash mouth game, not really an amazing fantasy game. So I'm trending towards not risking those.
Yeah, there's 2 spots where we need to 2 FFPC teams where we have Andrews, and we need to figure out what we're doing. One of them is a main event team where we also already played Hawkinson at tight end. So the question is going to be, do we flex Andrews? We have Rager in that league, so I'm thinking that we can wait till Monday night, see if at that point we'll feel much better about, I think, going with Andrews. If there haven't been any more positive tests, etc., the game looks like it's on. The other game, we don't have a tight end. We need to figure out what we're doing. We're talking through a bunch of gross options. One of those gross options being Will Dissly. I think Will Dissly is pretty interesting for Andrews owners because, again, he plays Monday night. So that's one way to handle it. I think if you have any real option, then like an option better than Will Dissly, I probably roll with that because we also have the question of whether or not Lamar Jackson even plays, right? So
he's not. I don't think he can.
I think right. So you're talking about a Lamar Jackson-less Andrews. That's not that appealing.
Right.
So if you've got a better option, I would roll with it. Take away that mega downside risk of not getting him at all, and the upside limited without Lamar Jackson.
So what about KC in this game? Let's talk about them. I haven't seen a lot of I would say this, and I'm not trying to sound cool, but I don't end up catching a lot of other people's content during the season. And so I can't speak to whether he's been mentioned, Tyreek Hill's been mentioned a lot in other content, but I haven't seen a lot of tweets or that's usually where I see other people commenting on stuff to the degree that probably we should be talking about him or ownership in certain, slates. I guess KC's maybe not been on the main slate for a while, but Tyreek Hill has been really good lately, incredibly good. He's averaging over 100 yards per game over his last 3, and close to it if you want to include the game before that. The volume has been way better. He was at 6 targets in 4 of his first 5 games, and then 3 targets in his 6th game, so 6 or fewer in 5 of his first 6 games. But since then, we have 10, 6, 18, 14 as his target numbers. I mean, just monster targets, averaging 12 per game in that last 4-game stretch. He scored 6 touchdowns in that stretch. One of the big reasons to like him is the really high TD rate. It was a case I made for him in the offseason that last year he had a couple games where he left really early. So when you look at his numbers on a per game basis, it's not great. But when you look at his TD rate on a per target, per snap basis, it's always been really strong. And we would expect it to be in this offense and with Mahomes. And he's really scoring a ton of touchdowns right now. And Kelsey's smashing as well, which is part of the reason I don't think people are talking about Hill as much. But he's been elite over the last month.
He has, yeah. I noted on StatChase, he had 3 of his best games in Whopper this season. His 3 best games in Whopper this season have occurred over the last 4 games. And since week 7, he's wide receiver 5 in Whopper. So just huge volume for Hill. And I think partly obscured by just how good Kelsey's been, partly obscured by the slow start. But he's been awesome over the last 4 or 5 games. I think
feels like a good spot to be playing him. 50-16 total. I mean, Tampa Bay pretty good against wide receivers. Carlton Davis is good. Is Carlton Davis a fast corner? I don't actually know a lot about him.
Yeah, and I wonder if people will be afraid of the matchup here after we saw the Rams pass a lot on them.
Right.
So that'll be kind of interesting. in terms of DFS stuff, I do want to look at the ownership projected on some of these guys like Hills and Kelsey. I think Kelsey probably pretty chalky, don't you think?
I would expect so, and that might be part of the reason that Hill stays down is if someone's going to pay up for a KC option, fill in the tight end slot with Kelsey is a lot more favorable. But Hill certainly has the potential to put up a 200-yard game. You know, he's only maxed out at 113 over these last couple of games. The big thing for me is it's not been just air yards. He's been seeing a lot of volume underneath. Like some of these games, he hasn't even had a huge ADOT. And so if you're, catching a ton of short passes as well as still having the Tyreek Hill 60-yard touchdown potential, I mean, he's one of the clear slate-breaking potential players. And, yeah, I'm seeing ownership projections at like 10%.
Wow. All right, that's pretty interesting then. He'll be someone I'll be trying to get in. And, yeah, I think you're in a situation where people aren't going to want to have to pick the Tampa Bay guy either. So you could end up with depressed ownership on the Tampa Bay weapons because it's like, who do I pick? And I think the answer is probably Brown, but maybe I could see a case for Godwin too. I think Evans, it's just tough for me with Evans. I mean, although he has the red zone role. So, but yeah, I think that's the ownership is probably going to be just reduced because it feels tough to know who to even play. Although I can't get on board with Brady.
The Tyreek Hill, Antonio Brown, hate yourself for playing bad human beings correlation is
I like this. It's sort of a shower narrative of sorts of kind of both being psychopath.
But yeah, Carlton Davis 4.53 40-yard dash, so not fast. That's what I thought. So yeah, I'm not really concerned about the matchup at all. Anyway,
all right. I think that Kansas City's good. Pat Mahomes is good. No other notes for me unless.
Yeah. What about CEH though? I mean, I don't like his upside. And you wrote 3-way running back split. We don't have to jump into it, but like Le'Veon Bell's still playing full drives. That was a big note for me right when he started. He's not playing a ton. His role's not huge, but no one else was ever leading drives. It was like coming in on passing downs with Darrell Williams. Le'Veon Bell is still getting in on about every third drive from the start of the drive. They're giving him the drive, which is not good for CEH. His snap share did bump back last week, but it's not – I don't see the massive upside if you have another back who's doing that and Darrell Williams, to your point about a 3-way split, but still running routes.
It's a little Rams-esque where you've got CEH would be like the Darrell Henderson where he starts the game, but then you've got Darrell Williams coming in for some passing down stuff. He would be the Malcolm Brown. And then Le'Veon Bell is like a Cam Akers where he just like gets drives to himself. And the thing that sucks about that, and you saw this with Cam Akers this past game, it's like if the guy happens to be on a successful drive, they'll leave him in at the goal line, and then Cam Akers gets that rushing or that receiving touchdown, and he's not even a receiving type of dude. And I think it's a similar downside risk here, where if Bell happens to be on a successful Kansas City drive, I don't think CH is coming in at the goal line. I mean, CH has not been very good in that role over the course of the season. Certainly not good enough to where they're going to bring in over Bell. So,
and they did. Yeah. They did. I mean, CEH had 2 touchdowns last week, but Bell had 1 as well. I mean, that's what happened. What you just said.
Yep. So, I think generally avoiding the backfield. So moving to Chicago at Green Bay. Green Bay, a 9.5-point favorite, 44.5 team total. Green Bay with a 27-point team total. Pretty nice team total here. Chicago at 17.5, pretty gross. So kind of a lopsided victory as far as Vegas sees it, and probably pretty much everyone else. Not going to be a ton of interest here in the Chicago side. One thing I'll note is that something that jumped out to me on stat chasing was that while the snap share was more towards Jamal Williams and less towards Aaron Jones than we're used to seeing, it was within the range of the typical outcomes of that split. It wasn't like some outlier where it was like, man, Jamal Williams getting a ton of work in this game. No, it's pretty – you do see them at 50-50, and that's what you saw. The bigger concern here is that the value of this backfield just hasn't really been there over the last few weeks. This would certainly be kind of a get-right spot for the value of the backfield, where you could easily see, I think, 30 total expected points out of the backfield in this game, and maybe 18 to 20 of those going to Jones here.
I like that. That's a good way of breaking that down. Yeah, this game, I mean, Trubisky starting for Chicago makes me not excited about their offense. I wrote, can Montgomery have a good rushing game against Green Bay, or do we even care? I don't want to play him. I don't have him anywhere. Not with a 17.5 team total. Am I going to be on him? He does run routes and whatever. You can play him in showdown, but I'm not probably going to be playing a lot of Chicago anywhere. And then for Green Bay, I think you broke down the running backs well. And then Devontae Adams is still just such a suffocating force on the target shares. When he can win and when he has his big games, it's really hard for anyone else to be very productive.
One thing I'll note is that I've been kind of on stat chasing just week after week. I'm like weirdly on this pro MVS narrative. And I just think that one thing, like Ben, I'm sure you've seen a little bit of this too. Like one thing that I notice when I'm going through like week by week is just stuff that's like consistent and just week after week just stays consistent. And one of those things for me, maybe the biggest thing all season, has just been MVS has this high ADOT. He gets a pretty solid share of the air yards. He doesn't get a ton of the targets, but it's just like no matter. And we've had injuries. We've had injuries to Adams. We've had various injuries to Lazard, etc. And it just doesn't really matter what's happening. He's sort of the sun, and everything else kind of revolves around this. MVS is going to get a few deep shots type of role. He is.
Devontae Adams is the sun. He might be like MVS something else stable.
MVS is the stable sun. Devontae Adams is just,
he's just revolving around MVS.
Yeah. No, but obviously Devontae Adams gets a ton of the value, but we can count on MVS, I think, to have that deep threat role. And so, for showdown purposes and stuff, like I don't care that Allen Lazard is back for MVS. I just don't think that affects him. It actually affects Adams just slightly because, maybe there's like one designed target to Lazard that wouldn't have gone to Adams instead or whatever. So it has the tiniest impact. I think it has a much bigger impact on Tonyan. I think Lazard and Tonyan are going to kind of cannibalize each other week to week when they're both out there, because those guys are kind of competing for non-Devontae Adams intermediate targets. Whereas MVS is just going to kind of get his deep shots regardless.
Yeah, I think the deep role is clearly there, but there's going to be games where he only gets 4 targets, like you said, and then it's very boomer bust. And he's been very efficient, and it's the kind of role where the efficiency, Aaron Rodgers is good, and he's getting one-on-one matchups. Efficiency can be there, but it's not really something you bank on. And I think he will have some bust games as well, pretty quick. He's been on a pretty good roll lately, especially. And then with Lazard back, I think it just cuts into his target. The secondary targets get even thinner. So it's tough. And Tonyan is a key part of the offense as well.
Comparing Marquez Valdes-Scantling to the Sun may have been a little bit overstating things, but we're at hour 2 here. So let's drive through things quickly, as we only have 2 games left here before we close out. The Monday night game, Seattle at Philly. Seattle favored by 5, total of 50. Seattle with a team total of 27.5, Philly 22.5. Bunch of interesting notes here, I think. You put Rager game, Aguilar or Alshon game as questions here. Rager has been a little bit concerning to me as I've looked at his ability to earn targets this season. We've now seen a decent sample size from him, and he's not really getting targeted at a high rate. That is something that I'm not panicking over or anything, but definitely a little bit of a bummer, considering that I thought he might be able to kind of jump in and dominate targets right away. Only 15.7% target per route run on the season. His weighted target per route run is 0.44, which actually isn't that bad. And so the whole thing might come down to the fact that he is a deep threat. He has an 8 out of 14 on the season. And, maybe that can change if he gets a few more deep targets, then all of a sudden his role looks awesome. But the bigger concern for this entire offense is that Carson Wentz is just played bad. And now we've got a split here with Miles Sanders, kind of not exactly in a 50-50 split, but I think he had 60% of the snaps or something this past week. Not what we would expect. So where are you at on the Eagles and the Seahawks this week?
I put Rager game question mark and Alshon roll question mark, not Alshon game.
Roll.
I don't.
Okay,
I'm
that
not
makes
ready
a lot
to
more
call it an
sense.
Alshon game. I'm confused about what his role might become, and I think. Whatever. Like he could have more of a role. They've talked about maybe wanting to get him involved.
They've talked
more.
about it.
Yeah,
I'm not really buying it, but
I'm not really buying it either. That's why I'm clarifying that. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be like an Alshon game. It's obviously a good matchup. We know what Seattle does to teams. They throw and they get thrown on. And so the regular game comment was, to your point, he's gotten some deep targets. This would seem like a really good setup for him to have his best game as a pro so far. You can get lulled into like expectations and not meeting them over and over and over again. But if you told me that Rager had his breakout game in week 11, because he had if you told me he had an injury and then he had his breakout game in week 12, I guess, I wouldn't have thought that was that crazy. There's a lot of rookie receivers that break out week 10, week 11, week 12. This isn't that out of line. Some of the other rookies have kind of made it tough for us to keep trusting the Laviska Shenaults and the Ragers and stuff. I expect Laviska Shenault and Jalen Rager to have big games before the end of the season. There's 5 more games, 6 more games, whatever it is. I expect them both to still have big games. I'm not giving up on that. And I think this is a really good opportunity for Rager to do that. So he's somebody I'll be certainly playing in like Monday Night Showdown slates and everything, and in maybe a couple seasonal leagues where I have him. If I need to play him, he's not. I'm not going to rank him as a clear starter or anything like that if I were to be doing rankings. But it's a good setup, obviously, against Seattle. It always is. I think
had the shoulder issue, had the torn thumb. I mean, there's reasons why he hasn't been absolutely smashing from the start.
And then Ertz back, impacts Goddard. Goddard ran routes on 95% of dropbacks, played every single snap the other week, last week. Ertz is probably going to cut into that to some degree, but I wouldn't expect Ertz to come back and immediately dominate. He wasn't very good.
Terrible.
Just there'll be something to watch. I'm going to be playing Goddard and not playing Ertz and watching it. You mentioned the Disley thing, and I think Hollister is interesting. They're probably both going to play. Disley played way more snaps, but Hollister still ran close to the same amount of routes. Disley's more of the two-way tight end. Hollister's basically receiver only. So I think for fantasy purposes, it might make it more 50-50, which is kind of tough. We'll get Chris Carson back here as another one, but Philly's more attackable through the air. So I'm hoping we see Seattle go back to more passing, but they started to trend towards their 2019 selves last week. A lot more running, a lot more sort of ball control and playing off that.
Yeah, we need Philly to step up and keep Seattle passing. That's what we need. And I don't know if we can count on that. Question from Brandon here. Is this going to be a new consistent show? Yes, this time, 4 o'clock on Fridays. We are going to be doing this every week.
And we're not planning to go 2+ hours every week.
No, we're not.
This is our first time to kind of compare notes on a lot of stuff that we haven't gotten to yet. So makes sense it went a little long.
I knew it would happen, but I was hoping it wouldn't. So on the running backs, we had another question here on playing Miles Sanders or waiting on Deontay Johnson. And I think it's a fair question because Miles Sanders had 60% of the snaps. That was the correct stat to Scott's 40%. 15.1 expected points to Scott's 6.2. So that was better. There was only one green zone carry in the game. Sanders lost a fumble on it. I think I'd probably just lock in Sanders if I had a decision like that. But I get it, especially in a pass, up-tempo script, you could see, you're thinking about starting Sanders and you're going, oh, God, they're going to end up playing Scott a bunch in kind of a Chase Edmonds-y type of role where Sanders is like a Kenyon Drakey type of, fade.
No, it's not that bad. He still ran routes on 45% of dropbacks.
Yeah.
It's not the 70% we saw earlier in the year, but I think, especially with him coming back from an injury, it's been a couple of weeks now in a row where he only ran routes on 44%, 45%. He gave up some routes to Scott, but he did have the fumble, and sometimes that impacts in-game usage. And I would kind of argue that it probably did here because he came back to a 72% snap share and then it went down to 60%. Not a lot of reason for that because he hasn't been inefficient or bad. And Scott's been good. Scott had a long touchdown run in Sanders' first game back.
Yeah.
So maybe Scott's just earning a little bit of the
and a fair amount of that usage came before the fumble for Scott. So I went back and looked, and it was are we just seeing like him getting punished for fumbling Sanders? But no, I mean, I think it was somewhat related to that long run. Scott playing pretty well, but yeah, I wouldn't panic. I would go with
Sanders. I mean the where I was trending there is he had 17 touches and 19 touches in those games. He had 5 targets in both those games. The 45% routes per dropback isn't what we hoped for earlier, but he's still seeing targets. So he only caught 5 of those 10 targets the last 2 weeks. Some of it is just that the efficiency hasn't been there as a receiver.
Yeah. All right. Final game here. Did you have any other notes here? No. On the tight ends, I kind of prefer Hollister to Disley. I think Disley's a blocking tight end.
Yeah, I kind of do as well. And then obviously Seattle's just like, you play Russ and you play Lockett and you play Metcalf.
Yeah.
Like, every week.
Yeah. But Disley is available some places like FFPC. Hollister's long gone. So, we'll probably be picking up Disley on Sunday for Andrews insurance, et cetera. So I like him. I like him as Andrews insurance and tight end premium. Speaking of Andrews, Baltimore at Pittsburgh, probably being played on Tuesday, hopefully. Pittsburgh favored by 4.5, total of 45. Pittsburgh with a team total of 24.75 to Baltimore's 20.25. This is just a tough game with so much uncertainty on Baltimore. We've got probably more interesting stuff, more tangible stuff that we can talk about with Pittsburgh. I guess I don't know. Ben, I'll throw it to you. You can start with whichever team you want.
Well, yeah, we've seen Pitt be really pass heavy and even in big wins the last few weeks. That's been the big storyline for them. Claypool's been running slightly fewer routes, but now we have Juju banged up. I don't know where we're at with him, but he got banged up late last week, but wasn't heavily involved. You and I had talked a little bit going into the week, and I wrote in Signals last week that Deontay Johnson's the guy that you trust the most for targets and air yards mix. Claypool's obviously the air yards kind of lock. They're the sort of the two that are the most valuable. Juju's been pretty consistently the third most valuable because with him you need a bunch of targets, and he has gotten them, but because they're all underneath. I don't think he's had a 100-yard game yet, even though he's had games of 14 targets, 13 targets. Yeah, he hasn't. He's maxed out at 93 yards in a single game. So at that point, you're pretty dependent on receptions. You're dependent on touchdowns. Whereas Claypool and Johnson have the potential to see these downfield targets and pick up bigger chunks of yardage, obviously. So even if Juju's healthy, and I love him, but I'm going Deontay. Claypool's running fewer routes, but he's been having this just massive weighted targets per route run because he's seeing so many air yards. He led the NFL in air yards last week, even in this fewer route percentage role. So you got to have Claypool ahead of Juju right now as well.
Yeah, I think if I were going to rank them as like NFL players, I'd probably rank them Claypool 1, and then like Juju and Johnson would be close to each other. But at this point, maybe I would rank Johnson 2 and Juju 3, just because I do think that this role and this, these targets probably are related to Juju, the player. But Juju has had a ton of success early in his career, so I'm less confident about that. I think from like a play perspective, the roles are really dictating and forcing our hand to where it is Deontay 1, Claypool 2, Juju 3. If Claypool was out there for 100% of routes, then, oh, man, he would be really exciting. But like last week, he got 140 air yards, only ran around on 70% of dropbacks. Deontay Johnson out there for 98%, which even for a wide receiver 1 is a very high rate. You don't tend to see guys up close to 100% of routes, except kind of the elite route runners. So that's pretty exciting. But then Claypool, 17.5 ADOT, he gets targeted at a really high rate, both for how much he's out there and also for his ADOT. He's one of these deep threats who gets targeted deep downfield. He kind of has as you look forward into what he could be in the future, I would compare him to sort of like a Kenny Golladay type of dude where he can operate as his team's deep threat and also dominate volume. So obviously, Claypool, very, very exciting in a longer window, but I agree. I think Deontay Johnson is the number 1 raw play right now.
Yeah, I mean, Claypool probably has the higher ceiling, and the usage on like end arounds near the end zone is also really exciting. So that He has the touchdown splash. I just think purely from a target, air yard, sort of floor play, it's Deontay on a weekly basis, but Claypool probably ceiling play.
Yeah. What about Eric Ebron? Because he's starting to see a lot of routes. Ran a route last week on 89% of dropbacks, which is like wide receiver level route running. You don't normally see tight ends up at that range. I mean, you get it from like Evan Ingram and Logan Thomas and a few other guys, but typically, tight ends are down more in like you'll see guys in the 60s that are like TJ Hawkinson's often in the 60s, even though he's the clear tight end one. So that's really nice to see, but Ebron doesn't get targeted at a really high rate. So he does need to be out there a lot in order to deliver fantasy value. 15% target per out run last week, 13% the week before, 15% before that. And, I'm typically hoping to see tight ends above 20%. So those are pretty bad numbers, but out there a lot. So I think the way I view Ebron personally is sort of he's a decent bet for a touchdown just because he's out there so much. And on that alone, he's interesting. But I think it's like he's gotten a nice little run of success recently. So maybe the market's getting a little too high on him. I don't know. Where are you at on Ebron?
He's a really interesting guy for the idea of like, can targets per out run scale? Because when he was with the Colts, he wasn't running a ton of routes, but he would, I'm pretty confident.
He had a high targets per out run there.
Really high targets per out run, right? So now he's running tons of routes and hasn't necessarily scaled because it's a different role. And so that's something to keep in mind when trying to scale things or consider smaller usage and whatnot. I think he's a fine tight end. We talked a little bit earlier in the show, I think, right, about Hooper and him and did I say that on this show? This is a long show.
That was this show. That was not like an earlier show we did. This was this.
Well, it feels like we've been doing this for 3 days.
All right.
Ebron. I wouldn't be playing him this week probably because I don't think he's really like valuable enough to chase unless you don't have any other option. But I'd play guys like Hooper over him because we don't know if this game's going to play. But yeah, he's in that range of like probably tight end 12 to 14. And we saw a touchdown last week finally to back up the routes, which was great.
With like Claypool and Deontay, like what type of like we talked about Miles Sanders over Deontay Johnson. I would do that. At what point are you like holding out and playing Deontay or Claypool? Because I don't really want to hold out and play. I already talked about playing Rager over Mark Andrews. I think that's kind of, one, you can wait until Monday to do it. And then 2, I'd probably just straight up do it. So because we're not going to have Lamar Jackson. So all the Baltimore stuff's easy. Like you're not really going to hold out for Gus Edwards in this bad matchup with no Lamar. But you might want to do it for Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool. So I honestly think we don't really even have to talk too much about the Baltimore side of this because you're probably sitting a lot of these guys, even if, it's a season-long league because you don't necessarily want to be taking the huge risk that this game doesn't go off. But yeah, on the Pittsburgh side, like where are you at with what kind of option do you need to sit these guys?
Because wide receiver is such a high variance position, it doesn't have to be that great of an option. I know that's weird to say, and Deontay, and we just talked about how pass heavy they've been, but this is a tough matchup, obviously, Baltimore, and it could be a weird game, especially if Baltimore's not competitive with Robert Griffin playing QB. I just said Pittsburgh's been throwing a ton, even when they've been dominating teams, and I would expect that to continue. But it also wouldn't be crazy to see the Steelers have kind of a poor passing efficiency game. I don't think you're chasing the stat lines like we saw from Deontay last week. I don't think you're going to see that in this game, right? Like, do you envision that type of ceiling?
No. I mean, yeah, and the team total here, 24.75, total 45.
So if there's a receiver who has a reasonably overlapping range of outcomes, since I'm already kind of dipping Deontay's ceiling down and probably the same for Claypool, I'm okay going with that player. It certainly depends, right? Like I have a league where I have, I guess, Deontay and Juju, and I put them both on the bench for now, just because like I had reasonable other options. I think one was Boyd, and it was like, yeah, I'm really down on Boyd right now, but like Boyd can still have 8 catches from a bad quarterback, and I think his range of outcomes still overlaps enough with Deontay that and they're playing the Giants. Like, it's not like a terrible matchup or anything, that I'm willing to play Tyler Boyd over him to get out of the uncertainty.
Yeah, that's tough. I think I'd probably play Deontay unless that type of decision could. Well, I mean, it's liable to be a playoff week for you, but I guess my thinking on this, honestly, is that the NFL has to change so many things up if they move this game back past Tuesday, and I just don't think they're going to do it.
Yeah,
I think this game's going off. So if I had like Tyler Boyd or Deontay, I'm probably playing Deontay. I don't even want to say that because I feel like do whatever you want to do with your own teams. But I'm just telling you, honestly, if I had a team that I was not co-managing with anyone else and it just was going to affect me, I would play Deontay on that team. So that could be a terrible call, but I'm just being open about what I would do.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
AJ Brown or Antonio Brown or Deontay. I think I'd go Antonio Brown. So that's kind of the range for me.
That's where you're at. Okay.
Yeah.
If you're playing Showdown, I mean, do you have any interest in Dez Bryant if this game goes off? He ran routes on 49% of dropbacks. He was actually involved in a way. Like, he didn't see a bunch of targets, but he's running routes.
Yeah, so that's a note for this show that we can never go past 2 hours and 20 minutes or we start talking about Dez Bryant. No, I'm not.
That's the only usage note on Baltimore's side that was new. So
I'm not interested in Dez Bryant. I do think Dez Bryant is, obviously slaughters whatever minimal value you can hope for from Devin Duvernay. I think it's a pretty bad sign that Devin Duvernay lost routes to Dez Bryant for dynasty purposes.
Yeah,
but that's what jumped out to me. But yeah, no, I mean, 59% of dropbacks for Dez Bryant worth mentioning. All right, let's call it. This
we can talk about J.K. Dobbins rest of the season. Just kidding.
I would have loved to do that, but let's do that next week. We're going to be back doing this again next week. We're going to tighten it up. We knew this would run long, but what are you going to do? If you're not reading Stealing Signals, you should do that because a lot of what we're talking about on the show is going to be referencing Ben's work with Stealing Signals. Subscribe to Stealing Signals through Substack. Ben Gretch. What's the exact thing that they need to do, Ben?
BenGretch.substack.com.
BenGretch.substack.com. Follow Ben on Twitter at YardsPerGretch. I'm on Twitter at Pat Kerrane. We will see you on this channel on Monday as I'll be doing stat chasing. Then we'll be back for ship chasing on Wednesday. And then we'll be back here doing chasing signals with me and Ben at Friday at 4 p.m. next Friday. And I'm stalling as we do the outro. Peace.